Members will take their seats and our guests theirs. We will get started with the markup. Good morning, everyone. This morning we meet to mark up more than a dozen common sense bills, most of which are bipartisan. They've been thoughtfully and thoroughly considered by 5 of our subcommittees in the Energy and Commerce Committee. The 4 bills before us to improve the nation's health provider workforce were approved unanimously by our Health Subcommittee last month, and I thank the subcommittee for its work. They are H.R. 959, Title 8 Nursing Workforce Reauthorization Act, and H.R. 3728, the Empower Act, reauthorizing the workforce programs under Titles 7 and 8 of the Public Health Service Act. Now, these programs support the education, the recruitment, and the retention of many types of really important health providers. H.R. 5385, the Children's Hospital GME Support Reauthorization Act, will reauthorize payments to freestanding children's hospitals that operate graduate medical education programs in order to support the pediatric health workforce. And finally, H.R. 1676. This is the Palliative Care and Hospice Education and Training Act, and will establish a program to enable the training interprofessional health practitioners in palliative and hospice care in a variety of settings. This bill is particularly important to me, and one I've heard about its potential impact from specialists and disease advocates from across my home state of Oregon. And I was a co-sponsor of this in the past. Originating from the Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee, we'll consider H.R. 6032, the Smart IoT Act, to direct a first-of-its-kind study of the Internet-connected devices industry. Fresh off a unanimous markup last month in the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, H.R. 2345, the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act, H.R. 5709, the Pirate Act, H.R. 3994, the Access Broadband Act, and H.R. 4881, the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act, will all be before us today. From improving public safety to expanding rural broadband, these bills will collectively address many important parts of our communications ecosystem. We also will consider 2 bipartisan bills passed by the Subcommittee on Energy to address regulatory and technological challenges which hamper our ability to capture the benefits of clean, reliable nuclear energy. H.R. 1320 is good for consumers who pay for regulatory costs of nuclear energy. Meanwhile, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act establishes a public-private partnership to provide a pathway to have advanced nuclear fuels available to enable America's nuclear scientists and innovators to deploy the next generation of technologies. And last but not least, we'll consider 2 bills passed by the Subcommittee on Environment to reauthorize certain environmental remediation projects at the Department of Energy. Today's bills speak to the hard work of our members and staff on both sides of the aisle to enact meaningful, positive solutions that empower consumers, patients, small businesses, and all Americans. So I urge my colleagues to support these measures, and I look forward to advancing them to the full House for consideration. I now recognize my friend, the ranking member from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you.
3 minutes. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're considering 13 bipartisan bills that have worked their way through our 5.
The gentleman suspended.
Sure.
Shh. We can have order. Thank you.
Thank you. Today we're considering 13 bipartisan bills that have worked their way through legislative committees. We'll also consider 1 resolution of inquiry that I introduced last week regarding the President's inhumane family separation policy. I'll talk more about the resolution of inquiry further when it comes up, but it is critical that we approve this resolution since the Republican majority has not scheduled a hearing with Secretary Azar on how HHS is reuniting these families. Every committee Democrat has called for a hearing, and I reiterate that request today. HHS simply is not reuniting these families fast enough, and even when they are reunited, we're hearing heartbreaking stories of infants not even remembering their mothers. We need answers, and we're not getting them from the Trump administration. That's why we must pass this resolution, and then we need to hold a hearing. Now, let me turn to the legislation before us. We'll be considering 4 bipartisan public health bills, all with the goal of strengthening our health workforce. We'll consider a bill from Representative Matsui that supports the recruitment, training, and retention of nursing professionals. Representative Engel is sponsoring a bill that will improve education, training, and research into palliative care and hospice care. Representative Schakowsky has championed a bill that supports several important workforce programs operated by the Health Resources and Service Administration, or HRSA, and her bill would also boost training for geriatric providers who are increasingly in demand across the country. And then there's legislation from our subcommittee ranking member Green and Chairman Burgess that will allow children's hospitals to continue to train the next generation of pediatric providers. The committee will also consider 4 bills dealing with nuclear energy and waste cleanup. I support the 2 bills that address important nuclear legacy waste cleanups, as well as the bill to incentivize advanced reactor fuel development. Regarding H.R. 1320, I appreciate the willingness of Chairman Shimkus and Representatives Kinzinger and Doyle to work with me to address concerns I have with this bill. While I still have some questions, I do not intend to oppose the legislation. And we'll also mark up 4 bipartisan communication bills. One strengthens the FCC's efforts to crack down on pirate radio operators. Another sets up a process for the FCC to consider how to support internet-connected farming techniques. A third would help the federal government better target federal support of broadband. And the 4th bill examines important improvements to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and I look forward to supporting those bills. And finally, you also support Representative Latta and Welch's Smart IoT Act that came out of our Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee. So again, thanks to our members and staff for the work on these various bills, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Chair recognizes the gentleman, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Energy, former chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton of Michigan, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this morning we are going to consider 2 bipartisan bills passed by the Subcommittee on Energy last month to address the development, competitiveness, and regulation of nuclear energy technologies. So these thoughtful proposals reflect the same sense of urgency to begin resolving time-consuming and complex regulatory challenges for the licensing and developing new nuclear facilities and technologies. H.R. 1320, the Nuclear Utilization of Keynote Energy, or NUC Act, is a bipartisan bill, increases transparency, predictability, efficiency in the NRC's regulatory regime. In doing so, ratepayers throughout the country, as well as countless individuals and industry stakeholders who benefit from the application of nuclear technology, will realize the unique industrial, medical, and energy generation capabilities. We're also doing H.R. 6140, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, also a bipartisan bill, which lays the foundation for the development and deployment of new first-of-a-kind advanced nuclear reactor designs. Passage of these 2 bipartisan bills is important. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Are there members on the minority side seeking recognition? I see Ms. DeGette from Colorado recognized for 1 minute. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to speak in support of Mr. Pallone's House resolution of inquiry. I went down to the border a few weeks ago, and I met some of the moms whose children had been taken from them. And then we went over and we met some of the children who had been taken from their parents. I think that it is, frankly, un-American that we've taken these kids from their parents and we now can't reunite them. This is the greatest country in the world, and it absolutely sickens me to think that we now can't figure out 3,000 kids and their parents. I think it's very important that the Secretary of HHS transmit this information to the House of Representatives, and I think surely this should be one thing that we can all on this committee agree on. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chairman recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so pleased that we have 4 bills on today's markup that were unanimously passed through our subcommittee on Comms and Tech. First is Mr. Stewart's Suicide Hotline Improvement Act. We all know families or have family members that have been affected with suicide, and we look forward to seeing this bill to the President's desk. Mr. Lance and Mr. Tonko's Pirate Act, which gives the FCC more tools to combat illegal pirate radio operations. And then also Mr. Tonko and Mr. Lance's Access Broadband Act, which ensures federal funding for broadband deployment is tracked and efficiently coordinated. And finally, we have Mr. Lobsack and Mr. Latta's Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act. As we will hear next week at our rural broadband hearing, the benefits of expanding broadband access to rural America can open up really exciting opportunities for the ag sector. and hardworking farmers and ranchers. And I appreciate the support on these and look forward to moving them forward.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to share my concern that my colleague from Denver said about the children in Texas and along the border. Taking children away from parents is not a American value, and that's all I'm going to say on that. One of the bills we're considering today is H.R. 5385, the Children's Hospital GME Support Reauthorization Act. I'm proud to introduce with our subcommittee chair, Dr. Burgess, earlier this year. The CMGME program provides needed funding to train our nation's pediatric workforce, including pediatricians, pediatric subspecialists, and greatly needed in many communities around the country. Our legislation reauthorized the CHGME program for 5 years at $325 million annually and a $25 million increase over current levels. As of today, our bipartisan legislation has 73 co-sponsors, support from outside stakeholders, including American Hospital Association and the Children's Hospital Association. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like my full statement to be placed in the record, and I yield back whatever.
Without objection, that'll happen. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, I believe, is next. Mr. Kinzinger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for today's markup and including H.R. 1320, the Nuke Act. As those of you on the Energy Subcommittee know, Congressman Dolan and I have been working on this bill for over a year. I'm proud of this bill, which also includes Mr. Green and Mr. Latta as co-sponsors. And it makes practical reforms to increase accountability, predictability, and transparency for those regulated by the NRC. Specifically, it eliminates an arbitrary requirement that the NRC recover 90% of its budget from those it regulates and instead puts in place a predictable fee structure that bases regulatory cost on the nature of work. The bill creates additional stability by putting a cap on the total annual fee charged to each operating reactor, limiting NRC overhead costs to put the agency in line with similar federal agency spending and create achievable deadlines for major license applications. Nuclear power is at a critical impasse. We have 99 nuclear power plants, including 4 in my district, that provide reliable carbon-free electricity around the country, but many of those are facing early retirement, which means a loss of clean energy, good job, and seat in our global leadership on safety and non-proliferation. So I encourage all my colleagues to vote in favor of this bipartisan bill, which will maintain the NRC's gold standard of safety while reducing the regulatory burden on our existing plants, but also the next generation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 1 minute. Speak on.
I'm so pleased that we're here today considering these critical health workforce bills in a bipartisan way. I'm proud to lead H.R. 3728, the Empower Act, with Representatives Burgess and Bouchan by reauthorizing the Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program and establishing the Geriatric Academy Career Awards. This bill is critical to ensuring that we have the workforce in place to respond to the needs of older Americans. Right now, we are facing a geriatric healthcare workforce shortage, and as baby boomers age, the shortage will only grow. The Empower Act will train more providers, give family caregivers the tools they need to care for loved ones with Alzheimer's, and expands teaching centers to reach rural and underserved communities. The Empower Act brings us closer to building the healthcare workforce our seniors deserve. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Seeing none. Let's see, the gentleman from New York, I guess, Mr. Tonko, isn't it? Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Castor, were you seeking recognition? Yes. For 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And colleagues, I think it's very positive we're moving forward on a number of bipartisan healthcare workforce bills today. They're bipartisan, they're very important. I'd also like to commend Ranking Member Pallone for bringing the resolution that will expand our oversight inquiry of HHS on this horrendous Trump family separation policy. This is very important, and the committee really should take up oversight hearings. I'm sure some of my colleagues were on the phone on Friday when the HHS secretary said we'll have a conference call for all of Congress, but what happened on that call, for folks that don't know, is the secretary didn't answer many questions at all. He spoke for about 20 minutes, turned it over to another assistant secretary, and then the entire Congress. He took 3 questions. So what should happen is the Energy and Commerce Committee that has oversight of HHS should schedule a series of hearings. We have had time last week to have hearings. We could do it this week. It's a real shame that has not happened. I yield back my time.
Yep. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank Environment Subcommittee Chair Shimkus for his work on the 2 bills that were approved by that subcommittee in June. Mr. Shimkus has worked tirelessly to address nuclear waste issues, and I appreciate the attention he has given to sites that are still dealing with the consequences of our nation's entry into the atomic age. I support H.R. 2278 and H.R. 2389 and hope we can continue to work together to resolve the remaining unsettled aspects of the West Valley issue in the future. I also want to highlight 2 telecom bills being considered this morning. First, H.R. 3994, the Access Broadband Act, establishes an office to streamline management of federal broadband resources and creates a simpler process for small businesses to access those resources. We know the importance of broadband. It can be the difference between success and failure for students doing homework, job candidates building toward a new career, and entrepreneurs starting a small business. Second, H.R. 5709, the Pirate Act, would increase penalties and restrictions on pirate radio. Pirate radio can interfere with emergency broadcast signals and airport communications. Protecting our public airwaves is an essential part of protecting our communities. I thank Mr. Lance, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Expired. Other members seeking recognition? See none. The chair now calls up H.R. 959 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Health on June 27, 2018, and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 959, to amend Title VIII of the Public Health Service Act to extend advanced education nursing grants to support clinical nurse specialist programs and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Is yours bipartisan, or are there any amendment? It's close enough. Chair, for what purpose does the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 959, offered by Ms. Matsui.
Further reading of the amendment dispensed with. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 959 is a bipartisan bill that reauthorizes critical workforce programs for our nation's nurses. Nurses are an integral part of a patient care in many settings. They're often the most memorable part of the patient's hospital stays. But they're also in the community doing things like primary care and public health and prevention. We have many medical workforce shortages across our country, and we need to ensure that professionals are available to meet health care needs, especially in rural and underserved areas. Nurses contribute to that solution, and we must continue to train and support them. We know that it is expensive and time-consuming to become trained as a medical professional, but loan repayment and scholarship programs can help alleviate that burden. Those programs also alleviate a workforce to practice where they are needed, rather than only where they can receive enough compensation to repay their investment. I appreciate the work of my colleague, Representative Joyce, and this committee to advance this important legislation. I'd also like to express support for the other health bills we are advancing today. Our aging population will rely on a workforce with geriatric expertise, as well as access to patient-centered hospice and palliative care. The Empower Act includes a geriatric workforce bill I authored with my friend Representative Schakowsky, and I support the Puchita Act authored by my friend Representative Engel, which would fund training of physicians who plan to teach palliative medicine. Lastly, medical training at children's hospitals is also very important, so I'm pleased we have worked together on reauthorization for the Children's Hospitals GME program. My amendment to H.R. 959 is technical in nature. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Your chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 959 as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 1676 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Health on June 27th of this year and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1676, to amend the Public Health Service Act to increase the number of permanent faculty in palliative care at accredited allopathic and osteopathic medical schools, nursing schools, social work schools, and other programs, including physician assistant education programs, to promote education and research in palliative care and hospice, and to support the development of faculty careers in academic palliative medicine.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Gentleman from New York.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Pallone. I am proud to be the sponsor of H.R. 1676, the Palliative Care and Hospice Education and Training Act. I'm very pleased to see this bill moving forward today. The goal of palliative care is to alleviate suffering for patients and their loved ones, accompanying efforts to treat or cure illness. Palliative care can help patients and families cope with the symptoms, stress, and pain of illness, but too many aren't aware of these benefits. There is also a shortage of educated providers who can offer quality palliative care. My Palliative Care and Hospice Education and Training Act addresses these issues by expanding opportunities for training in palliative and hospice care. This bill also seeks to better educate patients, families, and health professionals about palliative care's benefits and encourages the NIH to expand research around this topic. I think that all of us, unfortunately, have known a loved one who has faced a serious or life-threatening illness, so we know too well the confusion and stress these situations bring. This bill will help us ensure that there is a well-trained palliative and hospice care workforce available to care for patients and bring much-needed relief to families. I want to thank Congressman Tom Reed and Congressman Buddy Carter for co-authoring this bill and all the bill's 284 bipartisan co-sponsors. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yield back.
Will the gentleman yield the balance of his time to me?
Yes, certainly.
I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding. Thank you for bringing the bill to the subcommittee where it passed unanimously. This bill has been co-sponsored by many members of the full committee, many members of the health subcommittee, and it builds our palliative hospice care workforce by establishing and supporting palliative care and hospice education centers through federal grants while enhancing research in palliative care at the National Institute of Health. And you know, I think this bill complements our committee's work and the House of Representatives' work on opioids. The 115 Americans dying from overdose each day, we focused efforts to increase access to treatment, incentivize development of opiate alternatives, and to help curb future addiction. The bill before us today can address this issue from a different angle. With the growing scrutiny on doctors prescribing opioids in the midst of this, we must remember that there are patients with recurring chronic pain. And while the use of opiates can lead to substance use disorder, these patients still need access to pain medications, particularly if they've been successfully maintained and managed on their opiates in close consultation with their doctors. This bill will ensure that we have a palliative and hospice care workforce that is adequately trained to manage patients with serious illness, which can include some aspect of chronic pain and chronic administration of opiates. I appreciate having the chance to share these insights. I appreciate Representative Engel bringing this bill to the subcommittee and now to the full committee, and look forward to its passage. I'll yield back to the gentleman from New York.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and if anyone wants my time, I'm happy to yield. If not, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia, strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor on this bill that currently has more than 280 bipartisan co-sponsors and was passed by a voice vote through our Health Subcommittee. This legislation supports funding to a variety of programs to provide palliative medicine training in a variety of settings, establishes a program to enable hospice and palliative physicians to train teams of interdisciplinary healthcare professionals in palliative and hospice care techniques, and expands the type of professionals trained to provide hospice care, including nurses and clinical social workers. When I served as a hospice pharmacy consultant before coming to Congress, I saw the impact that proper palliative care has on patients and families that are faced with incredibly difficult decisions at the end of their lives. This legislation ensures that there is a well-trained palliative care workforce available and ready for individuals with serious illnesses. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including this legislation in the markup today and enhancing care options for our aging and seriously ill population. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to offer amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1676 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 3728 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Health on June 27th of this year, and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 3728, to amend Title VII of the Public Health Service Act to reauthorize certain programs relating to the health professions workforce and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Any members wishing to offer a bipartisan amendment? Dr. Burgess is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3728, offered by Mr. Burgess.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying bill, the Educating Medical Professionals and Optimizing Workforce Efficiency Readiness Act, which was introduced with Representatives Schakowsky and Bucshon last year, will reauthorize the various workforce programs included in Title VII of the Public Health Service Act. Mr. Chairman, we worked with stakeholders to draft a technical amendment which brings the authorization level for the primary care training and enhancement program up to the fiscal year 18 omnibus level and is now more than $48 million. Additionally, it would raise the salary amount for the geriatric academic career awards such that it would more effectively attract and support the geriatrics faculty. That's faculty to take care of geriatric patients, not very old faculty members. The underlying bill aims to support and strengthen our geriatric workforce through the Geriatrics Workforce Enhancement Program and the Geriatric Academic Career Awards so that it can meet the unique needs of our ever-growing population of seniors. While Congress has appropriated funding for the Title VII workforce programs in recent years, it is essential that we reauthorize the program to ensure longer-term stability. These programs are vital to building and maintaining a well-educated, well-trained physician workforce. H.R. 3728 reauthorizes funding for the area health education centers, which also provide both medical education and healthcare services to medically underserved areas. Reauthorizing these Title VII programs is long overdue. I strongly urge my members to support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I will yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentlelady from Illinois has an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3728, offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentlelady will be recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Well, you've already heard about the reauthorization of the Geriatric Workforce Program and the reestablishment of the Geriatric Academic Career Awards, how critical they are. And I really want to thank Representatives Burgess and Bucshon for leading this bill along with me. The amendment is a technical amendment. It makes technical changes to ensure that the Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program can continue its important work while emphasizing the importance of funding the Geriatric Academic Career Awards. You've already heard how important it is for these programs to be reauthorized. Our nation is facing a severe and mounting shortage of healthcare providers to meet the needs of older Americans. It's estimated that by 2030, 3.5 million healthcare workers will be needed just to maintain the current access level for older Americans. So this means that unless we act now, seniors, especially those with multiple chronic conditions and cognitive impairments, may not receive the quality of care they need. The Empower Act confronts that challenge head-on with the Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program, and it's the only federal program dedicated to develop a healthcare workforce that maximizes the engagement of older adults and family caregivers while improving health outcomes. So it's very important in Chicago with Rush University Medical Center, one of the outstanding health and education institutions to receive grants for health resources and services administration from HRSA to administer a geriatric workforce program. I know many of your communities, of my colleagues, benefit greatly from these programs, and I urge a positive vote on this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on her amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Continue to chair. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3728 as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. Continue to chair. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. The chair will now call up H.R. 5385 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Health on June 27th of this year and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 5385, to amend the Public Health Service Act to reauthorize the program of payments to children's hospitals that operate graduate medical education programs and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Texas, Mr.
Chairman, I have an
Burgess.
amendment at the desk.
Dr. Burgess, clerk report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5385, offered by Mr. Burgess.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am offering this amendment with Mr. Green. It is a bipartisan amendment. This is an amendment to honor a Texan who's made a substantial impact on the world of pediatric medicine. Dr. Benji Francis Brooks was born in Lewisville, Texas, where I practiced medicine for 25 years. She grew up in neighboring Flower Mound, Texas. Both towns are in my district in the northern part of the state. At the early age of 4, she dreamt of becoming a doctor, and she operated on her sister's dolls with her mother's manicure scissors. She received a bachelor and master's degree from North Texas State Teachers College, which is now the University of North Texas, and went to medical school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston in 1944, received her medical degree in 1948. Dr. Brooks became one of the first women to enter the Department of Surgery at Harvard, where she completed her pediatric surgical training. She did return home to Texas to practice pediatric surgery at Texas Children's Hospital, where she was one of my faculty members when I was in medical school. She was the first female pediatric surgeon in the state and went on to teach at Baylor College of Medicine and at the time, the newly established University of Texas Medical School at Houston. And she established and led the pediatric surgery division. Mr. Chairman, I would also ask unanimous consent that to place into the record the official biography of Dr. Benji Brooks.
Without objection.
And point to the one statement in this at the conclusion of the biography. Dr. Benji Brooks was a lifelong fan of Texas. She credits much of her success to her childhood in the Lone Star State with its long history of strong pioneering women. In Texas, Dr. Brooks noted, "You can go as far as you can push yourself." And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Green and I do not agree on everything. There are days it seems we don't agree on anything, but we did come to a quick consensus to rename this Children's Graduate Medical Education Bill the Dr. Benji Francis Brooks Children's Hospital GME Support Act, Reauthorization Act of 2018. And the significance there is this is the 100-year anniversary of the birth of Dr. Benji Brooks in Lewisville, Texas. So I encourage my members to join us in support of this amendment and obviously support of the underlying bill.
Mr. Chairman, is the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield to the
Thank
ranking
you.
member.
Mr. Chairman, I express my strong support for our amendment to name the Children's Hospital GME Support Reauthorization Program after Dr. Benji Francis Brooks in support of the underlying legislation. Dr. Brooks was the first female pediatric surgeon in Texas. She was raised as the chair of the health subcommittee mentioned in Lewisville, Texas, and she received her medical degree from the first medical school west of the Mississippi, UT Medical Branch in Galveston. She did her pediatric surgical training at Harvard Medical School in Boston. After returning from Texas, she performed pediatric surgery at Texas Children's Hospital and also at St. Joseph's Hospital, where my wife and I were both born, and our children were born there back then. In 1973, she joined the newly formed University of Texas Medical School as a tenured full professor and established the Division of Pediatric Surgery, which she headed for the next 10 years. I'd like to have my rest of my statement and placed in the record. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a statement on this bill by the Children's Hospital Association. And I'll yield back my time.
Without objection. Time is yielded back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by the two gentlemen from Texas. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion is here. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 5385 as amended to the House. So all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 2278 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on the Environment on June 27th of this year and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2278 as amended by the Subcommittee on the Environment.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the bill? Any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman. Technically, it's not a bipartisan amendment, but I used to work on this issue with Mr. Markey, so in spirit, it's a bipartisan amendment.
All right. Are you striking the last word, or are you offered an amendment?
I have an amendment to desk.
Right.
Beg your pardon, is it 6140 that we're doing?
2278.
Let me hold till 6140.
All right, so we'll reserve your time. Other members wishing to offer an amendment on this bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2278 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. And the opinion share, the ayes have it, and the amendment and the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 2389 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Environment on June 27th of this year and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2389 as amended by the Subcommittee on the Environment.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? The gentleman from New York has an amendment at the desk.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2389 offered by Mr. Tonko.
And the staff will the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. H.R. 2389 addresses a unique site in my home state, the Western New York Service Center in West Valley. The site is owned by the state, but from 1966 to 1972, it was operated by a private business to reprocess spent nuclear fuel, primarily provided by the federal government. Those reprocessing activities ended decades ago, but high-level waste and transuranic waste continue to be stored at the site. This bill authorizes $75 million annually for 10 years for the West Valley Demonstration Project in order to ensure the site's cleanup continues. However, this is only part of the West Valley issue. DOE and New York State continue to disagree over who should be responsible for paying for waste disposal. At the subcommittee markup, language was removed that would have addressed the uncertainty surrounding these wastes. I believe it is clear that the high-level radioactive waste and transuranic waste left at West Valley were primarily derived from atomic energy defense activities and should be disposed of as such, but I also understand that DOE may not agree with that assessment. The bill, as amended at the subcommittee markup, adds a requirement for a GAO report to assess the options and costs for disposal. My amendment would make minor changes to the scope of the GAO request, including shortening the timeline to produce the report and requiring GAO to look at the origins of the waste being stored at West Valley. Ultimately, I believe the statute cares about the defense or non-defense classification of these wastes, not their ownership. Any explanation of the West Valley situation or evaluation of disposal options without consideration of the waste origins would be incomplete. It is unfortunate that we are not resolving the biggest disagreement over the West Valley wastes, but I hope we can continue to work together to ensure the site is eventually remediated and wastes are disposed of properly and fairly, and revisit the waste classification issue in the future if necessary. With that, I urge members to support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I thank you, Chair, and yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Tonko. Over is Shimkus.
Yes.
I want to thank the colleague. We support this amendment. This is a very difficult issue that's happened decades ago. It's just part of our nuclear legacy. And the basic premise is who ends up paying for this, and it's not a small cost. So as we gather more information, the GA report will help do that. And we will continue to move forward. Mr. Tonko has been a strong advocate of trying to address this legislatively, and having not worked only as a member of Congress, but also in previous roles and part of the group designed by the state to help address this site. He's a loyal adversary and a good friend when we can work together. So with that, I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back my time to Mr. Tonko.
And I thank the subcommittee chair for his comments and his commitment. And with that, Mr. Chair, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2389 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 1320 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Energy on June 21st of this year, and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1320 as amended by the Subcommittee on Energy.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. For what reason is the gentleman from Illinois?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1320 offered by Mr. Kinzinger.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This manager's amendment is the product of additional bipartisan work on this legislation. As discussed during the Subcommittee on Energy's consideration, there were still some areas where this legislation could be improved, and this amendment accomplishes that. Specifically, we increase the NRC's flexibility by using 2015 instead of 2016 as the base year for fee caps, and remove a provision that would have allowed the NRC to issue licenses while a hearing's pending. I appreciate the effort of Congressman Doyle and members and staff on both sides of the aisle in crafting this amendment so that we can report a strong bipartisan bill out of committee today. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit a letter of support for my bill and Rep. Flores' bill from the Nuclear Energy Institute for the record.
Without objection.
And I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill, and unless somebody needs my time, I'll yield it back.
Yeah, will the gentleman yield?
I will.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, first I want to thank the chair and the ranking members of the full committee and Energy Subcommittee for holding this markup and for your involvement with the Nuke Act. I also want to thank my colleague, Mr. Kinzinger, for his leadership in this process. We've had many conversations on the Nuke Act, and I appreciate the consideration and collaboration that has allowed us to get to a full committee markup for this important legislation. The nuclear energy industry supplies reliable baseload carbon-free emissions and is a strong job creator in Pennsylvania. However, the industry is facing a variety of pressures that will only increase as nuclear plants go offline. The United States is a world leader in nuclear technology, and it is important to provide transparency and certainty for nuclear energy industry. The Nuke Act accomplishes these goals by modernizing the NRC's fee structure and encouraging timely licensing decisions without sacrificing the NRC's mission to protect public health and safety. These reforms will not only support existing nuclear plants, but will also encourage investment in the next generation of nuclear reactors. By reforming the fee structure, this legislation will prevent fee increases for existing nuclear reactors as other plants go offline. These common sense changes will provide certainty to operators and give NRC the flexibility to meet its budgetary needs. The manager's amendment also applies the same fee predictability and principles to fuel cycle facilities. I also appreciate that the manager's amendment strikes a provision that would have allowed NRC to issue a permit before a hearing was conducted. Eliminating this provision will ensure that communities are able to be involved in the process and that an application is sufficiently vetted before it's granted. Once again, I want to thank Mr. Kinzinger, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Walden for their work and their efforts to improve this bipartisan compromise bill. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I look forward to moving this to the floor as soon as possible. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the senior member from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinzinger. The manager's amendment offered by Rep. Kinzinger and Doyle includes an important provision relating to the annual charges for fuel cycle facilities. My district includes the nation's only uranium conversion facility in Metropolis, Illinois. The facility is one of only 7 total NRC licensed fuel cycle facilities in the United States. Unpredictable and inconsistent NRC annual charges hinder the ability of a fuel cycle facility to make long-term business decisions. This year, the annual fee for Honeywell conversion facility increased despite the facility's current standby status and exceeds $1.5 million. The manager's amendment provides an aggregate cap for fuel cycle licensees and requires that changes in annual charges must be in line with changes in actual regulatory work associated with the license. This provision will help stabilize our nation's nuclear supply chain, preserve U.S. leadership in nuclear technology, and provide for high-paying jobs. With that, I thank the colleague for yielding, and I yield back to him.
I yield back to Malice.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize, strike last word in support of, or I presume in support of the amendment, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The manager's amendment before us includes several improvements to the bill. The amendment adds a new section requiring NRC to report back to Congress on efforts at the Commission to address instances of employees facing reprisal for raising safety concerns that differ from the Commission position on a particular licensing action. A recent internal NRC report identified several troubling cases of NRC employees who raised safety issues being passed over for promotions or being excluded from work activities by management. It's critical that our NRC staff feel comfortable raising issues with Commission actions without fear of workplace retaliation. The provision included in the manager's amendment will require NRC to report to Congress on actions it's taking to address this workplace cultural problem. The manager's amendment also includes several changes addressing concerns I raised with the bill, most importantly by striking a provision requiring NRC to issue a construction permit for a nuclear facility, even if an entity has filed a formal request for a hearing objecting to the project. And I appreciate the efforts of my colleagues, particularly Representatives Kinzinger and Doyle, to make common sense changes to the NRC licensing process that can ease the pressure on the nuclear industry without jeopardizing safety or the environment. And while I still have a few concerns with certain provisions in the bill, I urge my colleagues to support the manager's amendment, and I do not plan to oppose the underlying bill. I yield back. I don't think anybody else wants the time, Mr. Chair.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. You can share the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Yes, there are. I have an amendment and ask the clerk to report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 1320 offered by Mr. Upton.
And the amendment will be considered as read. Staff will distribute the amendment. This is a bipartisan amendment offered by myself and Mr. Welch. And I would just say briefly that this amendment requires that the NRC submits to Congress a report identifying the best practices with respect to the establishment and operation of a local community advisory board for members of the community that are impacted by the decommissioning of that particular nuclear power plant. The report includes lessons learned from similar boards that already exist throughout the nation, builds on information included in the NRC's draft guidance relating to its ongoing rulemaking for decommissioning nuclear power plants. Recent closures of nuclear power plants have impacted host communities in many huge ways. Local school districts have reduced tax base, community loses hundreds of highly paid jobs. Future economic development surrounding the decommissioned reactor is unknown sometimes, and as more nuclear facilities reach the end of their license period of operation, these effects will continue to be felt throughout the country, certainly in my district in Southwest Michigan as well. So at the subcommittee mark, Mr. Welch noted the experience of his constituents in facing such challenges. This report will examine previous experiences, identify the best practices for future communities, nuclear licensees, and all stakeholders to manage this transition going forward. So I would hope that everyone here could support this bipartisan amendment and would yield to my colleague and friend, Mr. Welch.
I thank my colleague, and I thank Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Doyle. You know, as we have discussed, Vermont is the home to the first merchant plant to be decommissioned in the country. And the decommissioning process has been a learning experience for all of us. And regardless of what your position may be on nuclear energy, if you have a nuclear plant in your district, it's a significant source of jobs, tax revenue, and economic activity. And the impact on grid reliability and security is one thing, but what I hope we can point out here is the real-world consequences on that local community. In Vernon, Vermont, the Vermont Yankee plant at one point employs 650 people, very good jobs, payroll is $66 million, economic impact of $500 million. And I imagine those numbers are similar to the Palisades plant in Chairman Upton's district. Today, the number of employees is down to 150 and declining. The plant that once supported half of the town's revenue and helped finance a library, a town hall, rec center, and school is now a skeleton. And as you can imagine, this change has had a very significant impact on this community and on Vermont. During a transition period as stressful as this, it's critical that the local stakeholders, that's the citizens, the folks who've been living there and working there, that they have timely access to information on what's happening, along with an opportunity to provide feedback on how the process should move forward. We've got to make certain that the community that's affected has real input into the process. We have a nuclear decommissioning citizens advisory panel, 19 members created by the Vermont legislature to be an intermediary between energy and local stakeholders. We have a number of regional commissions that are playing a role significantly. The Wyndham Regional Commission. In the amendment that I'm offering with Mr. Upton is about continuing to proceed on this work. There are big questions about decommissioning, big questions about how fast a pace that will occur, big questions in a community about trying to have the site be put back into productive economic activity. So I believe that this amendment offered by Mr. Upton and I is a very good first step in making sure that community voices in my community, in Chairman Upton's community, and others that are soon to be seeing plants decommissioned, that the citizens there have a big role in ultimately resolving this challenge. I hope to continue to work with the chairman to address these matters and thank my colleagues for their attention.
Gentleman yields back to
Mr.
me.
Upton, will you yield?
Yeah, I'd be glad to yield.
Thank you. I just want to thank you, Mr. Upton and Mr. Welch, for this amendment. I support it, and I agree it's vital to have community involvement in the decommissioning process, and I just want to urge all my colleagues to support the amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Claim my time. I want to thank everyone for working on this. Obviously, it's a key amendment for all of our communities when at some point they will face this if they've got a nuclear facility that's there. And I would again urge my colleagues to vote for it. I yield back my time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from the great state of Michigan. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion shared. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1320 as amended to the House. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion shared. The ayes have it. And the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 6140 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Energy on June 21st of this year and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 6140, to require the Secretary of Energy to establish and carry out a program to support the availability of HALEU for domestic commercial use and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, has an amendment. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6140, offered by Mr. Flores.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next generation of advanced nuclear reactors that are currently under development will vary in size and operation, and they will need greater flexibility and efficiencies from an advanced fuel which is currently not available. This advanced fuel, known as high-assay low-enriched uranium, or HALEU for short, is enriched at higher levels than what is available in today's commercial market. The Bipartisan Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, which I introduced with my friend Mr. McNerney, establishes a public-private partnership through the Energy Department's Office of Nuclear Energy to support the availability of HALEU for domestic commercial use. In short, this bill would ensure that there is a robust supply of advanced fuel available for the domestic commercial industry to purchase for the advanced reactors of tomorrow. Today, I'm offering a bipartisan manager's amendment with Mr. McNerney. This amendment makes two clarifications as requested by the folks at the House Committee. Number one, it excludes nuclear material that is currently allocated for national security use. And number two, it ensures that HALEU is made available under the consortium, or the fuel that is made available under the consortium must not be sold for less than fair market value. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment and the underlying legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chair, and I thank my friend Mr. Flores, and I want to support the amendment, and I want to speak on the underlying bill. Along with Mr. Flores, I'm delighted to work on advanced nuclear technologies through H.R. 6140, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act. This is the future of nuclear energy. We need a diverse energy mix, and nuclear provides a zero-carbon emission electricity. Say, if you believe that climate change is the problem, then you really need to think about nuclear power. It's a zero-carbon source of electricity. The availability of high-assay, low-enriched uranium is critical to these efforts. Federal investments and protocols regarding the transportation, fuel fabrication, and enrichment to effectively bring this fuel to the market are encouraging. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, will be useful in a variety of settings, and this type of fuel needs to be available by the time SMRs are more widely available. The consortium that is formed here is the type of partnership that will be useful in kick-starting this industry and then turning it over to the industry to let it take reins. Further, I support the manager's amendment, as I mentioned, clarifying that fair market value must be used and recognizing that defense programs also have needs for these materials. I look forward to working with my colleague, Mr. Flores, in moving this legislation to the floor, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Can you share? The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are further amendments to the bill. Gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6140, offered by Mr. Burgess.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would clarify that the Department of Energy stockpiles of depleted uranium must be treated the same as natural and low-enriched uranium when it comes to sales or transfers from the department's uranium inventory. Under current law, prior to transferring uranium from the inventory, the Secretary of Energy is required to determine that the sale of the material will not have an adverse impact on the domestic uranium mining, conversion, or enrichment industries. Mr. Chairman, foreign state-backed competitors continue to place significant pressure on our domestic uranium products. U.S. uranium production is at its lowest since the industry's infancy. Uranium exploration is down 75% in 2017 compared to 2016. The sole conversion facility in the United States recently suspended its operations. Losing United States uranium mining, conversion, and enrichment does put the United States entirely dependent upon other countries for a fuel needed to power 20% of the nation's electricity in the United States. We also risk losing a key source of necessary material for America's nuclear navy. U.S. mines are cost competitive on a global basis under the right policy conditions. This amendment addresses just a small piece of this potential crisis. And Mr. Chairman, I do recognize that there is not unanimity of opinion on this issue. And for that reason, I will withdraw the amendment today and not ask for the vote, but I do ask that we continue to work on this between now and the time that this bill comes to the floor.
Yes.
So ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Gentleman asks unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment. Seeing no objection, the amendment is considered withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman?
Are there further amendments? For what purpose?
I don't know if I'm able just to speak momentarily on that now that it's been withdrawn.
Well, you can move to strike the last word.
If I could move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized, strike the last word.
And Mr. Chairman, the only thing that I wanted to raise here, sir, is this is an important conversation that we're having, not just in the committee, but around the country. But the one thing I hope that we don't lose sight of as well, there are a lot of uranium mine workers that worked in the industry post-1971. The Congress took action to provide support to people that worked in those mines, national security interests, to make sure that families that were exposed to these conditions that are now diagnosed with cancer, and it's generational in these communities, but it's not been updated. We've since learned that many of the families that were covered in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that was updated, we had workers working side by side with different job titles. One person may get coverage, another person would not. Work side by side, just different job titles. And we've also since learned that there's different cancers that have been identified that infected these workers that should have been covered, but Congress has not moved. And so I'm just hoping that in light of this conversation that we also don't lose sight of the uranium mine workers and their families that continue to need help across America as well. And so I thank the gentleman for his indulgence and the chairman as well, and look forward to working with the committee on that issue as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank the gentleman's comments. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, the question now arises. Question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 6140 to the House. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The measure is favorably reported. The chair calls up H.R. 6032 as forwarded by the subcommittee. That's number 10 on the list. As forwarded by the Subcommittee on Digital Commerce, Consumer Protection on June 13th, 2018, and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 6032, to direct the Secretary of Commerce to conduct a study and submit to Congress a report on the state of the Internet-connected devices industry in the United States.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Does anyone want to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As chairman of the Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee, I have focused on emerging technologies that look 5 or even 10 years into the future to see how new technologies will benefit Americans. Whether it be self-driving cars or the Internet of Things, we have a responsibility to ensure we do not create unnecessary regulatory burdens that stifle innovation. With that in mind, I continued this work with my friend, the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, on a bipartisan basis to develop H.R. 6032, the State of the Modern Research Application Trends IoT Act, or the Smart IoT Act. The Smart IoT Act is an important first step to lay the groundwork for the many policy considerations in the Internet of Things space. The Smart IoT Act directs the Secretary of Commerce to survey industry and study efforts in the public sector regarding IoT. The resulting compendium of information will benefit both private industry and regulators. At the federal level, this bill will help promote good, streamlined government, and at the industry level, this bill will help provide innovators with information about industry-based efforts, as well as better understanding as to who to communicate with in government. Again, I want to thank my friend, the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for his work with me dating back to our IoT working group in the last Congress on this issue. I'd also like to thank all the stakeholders that have been important partners in developing and improving the Smart IoT Act. We appreciate their willingness to work with us on this very important issue. I urge my colleagues to support the Smart IoT Act, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields up balance of his time. Is there anyone else seeking recognition? Seeing no one, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 6032 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.Res. 982 and asks the clerk to report.
H.Res. 982, of inquiry requesting the President and directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services to transmit, respectively, certain information to the House of Representatives referring to the separation of children from their parents or guardians as a result of the President's zero-tolerance policy.
Without objection, first reading, the resolution is dispensed with, and the resolution will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? For what purpose the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment, or on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak in support of my resolution of inquiry, House Resolution 982, which is co-sponsored by every Democrat on the committee. This resolution would authorize our committee to request information from the President and direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to transmit information to the House of Representatives on the health and welfare of children who were forcibly separated from their parents as a result of the Trump administration's cruel and inhumane zero-tolerance policy. At this point, we have not been given adequate information by Secretary Azar to fully understand what is happening on the ground and how the administration is working to right the abhorrent wrong self-created by the Trump administration. It appears that HHS is attempting to reunite the separated families as a result of the zero-tolerance policy on an ad hoc basis, and reunification is not happening quickly enough. We've been given no indication that there is a formal process underway, and I'm growing increasingly concerned and frustrated each day as I watch this administration's lack of leadership in addressing this crisis. Secretary Azar continues to paint a rosy picture of how well the reunification is going, but every day we're hearing more heartbreaking stories that clearly show there's still a significant amount of chaos and confusion. Congress needs to access all necessary information to understand what steps this administration is taking to protect the children in its care and how we can ensure the trauma experienced by these kids never happens again. As I noted in my opening statement, it was reported just yesterday that some young children have been separated for such lengths of time that after being reunited with their parents, they do not even recognize them. This is unconscionable, and as noted by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Psychological Association, this separation could have long-term implications on the health of these children. Congress and the American people deserve answers. 3 weeks ago, every Democrat on this committee wrote the chairman requesting an immediate hearing with HHS on the well-being of the children that were forcibly separated. 1 week later, every Republican on the Health Subcommittee opposed an amendment at the subcommittee markup that called for a hearing on this matter. Democrats and Republicans have been trying to get answers from this administration only to be repeatedly stonewalled. And I agree with Ms. Castor, our vice-ranking member, that Secretary Azar's conference call last week raised more questions than answers. It does not substitute for the oversight responsibility of this committee to hold a hearing and receive testimony from relevant administration officials, including Secretary Azar and Scott Lloyd, the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We have a duty to get to the bottom of this, and I implore my colleagues to support my resolution of inquiry so we can receive all the necessary documents needed to conduct oversight. I also once again call on our chairman to reconsider my request to hold a hearing as soon as possible. It has been more than 3 weeks since we made that request, and so far the majority has not moved forward with a hearing. I can assure this committee that my resolution is neither premature nor overbroad. As I've already written to Secretary Azar twice on this issue, I've also talked to him, and at this point have received inadequate responses to my questions. Additionally, my resolution of inquiry only covers categories of information that are already in the possession of the President or the HHS Secretary, and nothing in my resolution threatens any basis upon which the President can assert executive privilege. I've also been mindful to draft the resolution in the proper parliamentary form to be respectful of the constitutional separation of powers. Now is not the time for our committee to be split along partisan lines. If we're truly to understand the impacts of this policy and exercise effective oversight authority, then our committee must have access to the information covered by the resolution. This committee, as well as the American public, must be reassured that the U.S. government cares about the physical and mental health of thousands of children, and we can begin to do that today by favorably reporting this resolution. And so I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and unless somebody wants my time, which is not much left, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for purposes of speaking on the resolution. I couldn't agree more with my colleague. This is not the time to split the committee on a partisan basis, and unfortunately, I believe your resolution has contributed to that. Let me say that Mr. Pallone filed the inquiry on July 3rd. It directs the President, Secretary of HHS, to produce broad categories of documents relating to implications of the President's zero-tolerance policy. I confess I was a little puzzled when I first learned that he'd filed this resolution of inquiry on the subject of the President's policy. Historically, these types of resolutions of inquiry are filed as a way of seeking information when a party, usually the administration, has refused to or is dilatory in providing information to Congress. They're kind of the last hammer you have, not the first. And that's simply not the case here. As members of this committee are aware, we have jurisdiction over Health and Human Services Office of Refugee and Resettlement. This committee has conducted extensive oversight of the department's management and care of unaccompanied children dating back to the Obama administration, when the department was completely unprepared for the number of children who crossed the border in the summer of 2014 and were placed in its care. We have continued that oversight starting then and even before and through as late as this week. That work continues in Congress. Fewer than 2 weeks ago, all the Republicans on this committee sent a letter to the HHS Secretary asking a number of very serious questions and requesting documents about HHS's care of children in its custody, including questions about medical treatment, how Health and Human Services vets the placement of children in the community, and HHS's management of the reunification process. It's worth noting that we offered our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle the opportunity to co-sign that letter with us, and ultimately they rejected that offer. I also led a delegation of committee members to Texas this past weekend. We cleared our schedules, we set up meaningful meetings to review each stage of the process adults and unaccompanied children go through when they attempt to enter the country illegally. We went to facilities managed by Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Like the letter we sent on June 29th, we invited the minority members of this committee to join us on this fact-finding mission, and I want to thank my fellow Oregonian, Representative Schrader, for coming. During our visit, we had the opportunity to ask a number of questions of the agencies who manage these facilities. We went there to get the facts firsthand, see it firsthand. So today, we will be distributing to members the initial report of the memorandum from our staff detailing what we observed and documenting the answers we got from HHS to the committee members' questions, including, I would note, many of the questions that Ranking Member Pallone rightfully has asked in his letters to HHS on June 14th and June 26th. In addition to the answers received on the ground in Texas, Secretary Azar, I know, has provided written responses to Ranking Member Pallone's letters just yesterday, and they have responded to us as well. This is what a serious oversight investigation looks like, and our fact-finding will continue. Now, for years, HHS has had a role in caring for unaccompanied alien children. Let me be very clear. I do not support, and I don't believe members on this dais support, separating children from their parents, period. Right now, HHS is in the middle of handling the reunification of children in its custody with their parents or family members. And from what we learned during our trip where we were there on Monday to Texas, it's a very delicate process that can have serious implications about the children's future welfare. In a court filing just this week, HHS described how certain individuals were not eligible for reunification due to their criminal history, being in criminal custody, or because they were not the parent of the child they accompanied into the United States. The problem HHS has experienced during the Obama administration, when it failed to do adequate background checks of the adults with whom it placed the unaccompanied children, illustrate what happens when HHS does not do its job well. At least 6 children were trafficked and ended up working in horrific conditions on an egg farm in Ohio. Others were released as sponsors with criminal records, including human trafficking, child molestation, and homicide. HHS needs to get this right, and we will make sure they do. That is our job on this committee. But if HHS and this committee are to learn the appropriate lessons from this situation and enact proper reforms, if needed, our oversight needs to be informed by the facts. If the minority's interest is collecting information and doing a thorough and serious review of HHS's role, I would submit to you that is something this committee did in 2014 and is doing now, and we'd ask you to join us in a bipartisan effort. I believe, however, that this resolution of inquiry is unnecessary and not a particularly effective tool to pursue that oversight when the committee is doing its work already and when the administration is cooperating and so far producing information in response to those requests. And finally, I would just say we have been told by HHS as of 7 a.m. this July 12th, this morning, there are 103 children under age 5 covered by the court order. Of the 103 children, 57 have been reunified as of 7 a.m. today. 46 were acknowledged by the court to be ineligible. The court said they're ineligible for reunification or determined by HHS, DHS, or DOJ to be ineligible under court-approved criteria. Of these 46, 22 children have been found ineligible due to safety concerns posed by the adults in question. 11 adults have a serious criminal history, charges or convictions of child cruelty, kidnapping, murder, human smuggling, domestic violence, etc. 7 were determined not to be the parent. 1 adult had falsified the birth certificate. 1 adult was alleged to have abused the child. 1 adult planned to house the child with an adult charged with sexually abusing a child, and 1 adult is being treated for a communicable disease. 24 children are not eligible for reunification due to circumstances of the adults in question. 12 adults have been deported and are being contacted. 9 adults are in custody of the U.S. Marshals Service for other offenses. 2 adults are in custody of state jails for other offenses, and 1 adult's location has been unknown for more than a year. This is how you get to the facts. We will continue to, and we will hold them accountable, because I don't think there's anybody on this dais that doesn't want to see kids well cared for and reunified with their parents in a safe position. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Chair recognizes Gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution.
Thank you. Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as the ranking Democrat on the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, if we had gotten all that information as a result of a robust O&I investigation, then I would say we were doing our work. But we got all that information because the ACLU sued the government and the judge made them provide all of this information. And to this day, I don't believe that 1 child would have been reunited with his or her parent because of what this committee has done. And I say, shame on us. It should be a bipartisan effort.
The gentlelady yield.
I will in a moment, Mr. Chairman, but let me say, I told you this. I told Mr. Harper this. We should have been all over this from day one. And I will also say that there are now the deadline of Tuesday of this week, which PS HHS did not meet, although they apparently have now met it, was for the very young children, I think 7 and under, or 5 and under, but there are still several thousand children who have not been reunited with their parents, and I see no result of any effort on behalf of this committee or the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee to get these kids reunited with their parents either. It's the federal judge who is requiring this to happen. And as a mother, I will say that I was horrified when I saw the media reports today and yesterday where some of these children were under such trauma, they didn't even recognize their own parents. What kind of a country does this to children?
Gentlewoman,
I just have to ask you. I'll yield to Mr. Pallone.
I agree with you. And let me just say this. I'm not suggesting, Mr. Chairman, that Secretary Azar doesn't return your calls. He does. And he talked to me. He had the conference call that Ms. Castor mentioned. But the problem is I don't really think he has any idea what's going on. When I went to the Elizabeth Detention Center on Father's Day, I had 2 fathers who had daughters, one who had a younger sibling who was 7 years old, who basically said that when the kids were taken away from them at the border, that they never heard anything again about them. They didn't know where they were. They had no communications with them. I then spoke to the secretary a couple days later, and he said, I don't understand, Mr. Pallone. He said, we have a policy where we have tracked every one of these kids. These parents or older brother can contact them. Here's the 800 number. You have them call. But none of that was the case. And I'm not saying he's lying, but I don't think he had any idea. I mean, the problem is they don't have the tracking system. There is no communication. There's this huge discrepancy between what he says and the reality on the ground.
And
I yield back.
Yeah, reclaiming my time. I was down there a couple of weeks before the committee went down there, and my group met with about 45 women whose kids had been taken from them. And the HHS folks and also the ICE folks said that the people could call this phone number, but they weren't given the phone number. They didn't have the phone number, and they didn't have the money to call because up until that point they had to pay to call. And they changed those policies later. But these are all things, and again, I think that Mr. Pallone is right. I don't think that Secretary Azar really knew about this, and I don't think there was very good communication, if any, between ICE and HHS. But the problem is, we're talking about reunification of families, and I'm not saying this to be partisan. I'm saying this because I think we can be doing a lot more in this committee. Mr. Chairman, out of comity, I'm happy to yield the rest of my time to you.
I thank the gentlelady. I think we share a concern about making sure parents and children are reunited in safe conditions. I don't think there's any disparity on this committee about that. We are working with HHS to set up an opportunity to go over to their Special Operations Command and take the committee there. This is where it's multi-agency involved in this issue. For the parents, as you're right, they are under ICE, not under HHS. The kids are under HHS. And part of what we learned at the border, because we set up, and that's where I wish more members, I realize it's hard to do this.
Excuse me, sir, I went to the border.
I was not going to say that, my friend. I know many members have gone to the border individually. I applaud you for doing that. What we were trying to do as chairman of the committee was put together a bipartisan delegation to the border where we had set up in advance opportunities to see literally from the Rio Grande through the initial detention facility with CBP, to the ORR facility, to the Gateway Bridge, to then the adult facility at Port Isabel. so that we could hear from and ask our questions of each element, even those agencies over which we do not have jurisdiction, to get the answers that our constituents and we all want. And so
Mr.
we're going
Chairman,
to
just reclaiming my time, I have my itinerary from Mike Hodel to South Texas from Saturday, June 23rd, and I'm happy to submit that for the record so you'll know that some of us saw every single thing that you saw too.
I'm not. Gentlelady's time's expired. Are there other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman, would the lady yield to me with your time?
This was Mr. Gett's time, and it's expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution.
I thank the chairman. I think that this entire issue is a stain on the soul of our country. I understand that there have been trips to the border. I, too, was part of one, I think, almost 3 weeks ago. I would have participated in the one that the chairman sponsored, but I had already been to a border control facility as well as an ICE facility. You know, I think for the majority that this is also a source of great embarrassment to you, and for many reasons. But there's no way that anyone can pull a rabbit out of a hat and say that we've done anything of any substance here at this committee that has jurisdiction over HHS. When the president announced his zero policy, his zero tolerance policy that separated nearly 3,000 children from their families, HHS has been thrust into the middle of implementing this disastrous policy. Now the agency has to address the fallout of the crisis by reuniting the families. And while HHS was not responsible for separating the families, I think we have to hold the agency accountable to reunite them promptly. And that has not happened. You're talking about single-digit instances. It's not happening. It simply is not happening. The mission of ORR is to house unaccompanied minors, not children who are separated from their parents at the border, and as such, there has been no plan for how these children should be reunited with their families. It's been 3 weeks since the president reversed his family separation policy, but despite the agency's efforts, thousands of children remain separated from their parents. That's a fact. It's reported morning, noon, and night, every single day of the week since this disastrous policy was put into place. Now, last month, a federal judge gave HHS a 2-week deadline to reunite the 102 children in its care who are under the age of 5. Yesterday, it missed that deadline, claiming logistical challenges such as DNA testing having delayed the release of the children. Now the government is facing a July 27th deadline to reunite the thousands of children that remain, of remaining children with their families, and it's unclear how it will do so in time. We have hearings on everything here, on everything from A to Z, and we should. Not on this. Not on this. Why? 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 In his testimony to Congress on June 26, Secretary Azar said, quote, "There is no reason why any parent should not know where their child is located." And he claimed his department could immediately locate any child in an HHS facility. But when I traveled to the border and met with mothers, by the way, in prison guard in an ICE detention facility whose children had been taken from them, none of them knew where their children were. Not a one. And they didn't have the money. They said they could make telephone calls. We wanted to put money in the kitty, but ICE said we couldn't even do that. So they couldn't make telephone calls to anyone. I also learned that all detained individuals, including children, are given an A number, an alien registration number, yet there is no interoperable system in place to link these numbers between children who are placed in the care of HHS and their families being held by ICE, creating widespread confusion between the agencies about their responsibilities respect to these families. I mean, this is, to call it a Rube Goldberg plan doesn't begin to describe it, except these are human beings. These are human beings. It's a rotten policy that was put into place. I don't blame Secretary Azar, but you know what? It's not happening. And that's why this resolution and this committee and having a hearing is really absolutely necessary. I think that this is I don't know whether some are in denial here, but this really does cry out, and everyone should be crying out to find out what the heck is happening. I wrote to the Secretary about 3 weeks ago. Maybe you can help, Mr. Chairman. I've never heard from HHS to find out if any children have been shipped into my district. So I support the resolution, and I yield back the time that I don't have anymore. Thank you.
Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of Ranking Member Pallone's resolution of inquiry. I visited 2 New York facilities in my district that are housing children thousands of miles away from their parents. And I can say from day one of President Trump's so-called zero tolerance policy, we have had 0 answers from this administration, only falsehoods. First, they denied children what were being ripped from their families, even when we saw kids in cages and heard their cries. Then they somehow claim that the president's own policy was Democrats' fault. Then they refused to tell us where children were being held, how they were being cared for, or how they planned to reunite them with their guardians. The court-ordered deadline to reunite children under 5 with their families was 2 days ago, and just over half of the children have been returned to their parents, not to mention the thousands of other minors who are still waiting. Calling this unacceptable does not begin to capture the gravity of the situation. Experts have told us that what the Trump administration has done will do irreversible harm to children. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I quote, "This type of highly stressful experience can disrupt the building of children's brain architecture. Prolonged exposure to serious stress, known as toxic stress, can lead to lifelong health consequences," unquote. It's clear that we cannot trust the administration to give us the facts about their barbaric policy and its devastating ramifications. And that's why this resolution of inquiry is necessary. We need every document, every record, and every other communication from the Department of Health and Human Services that concerns the health and welfare of children taken from their parents or guardians by the Trump administration. Only with that information can we even begin to address the crisis that this administration created. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. And if there's anyone who wants my time, I'm happy to yield it.
Yes. I'll take it.
Yes. Mr. Green.
Thank my colleague for yielding to me, and I want to express my support for the H.R. 982 and resolution inquiry directing HHS to deliver all documents relating to President Trump's zero tolerance policy to the House of Representatives. Mr. Chairman, I didn't know about the Codell from the committee. I gave a week's notice to go to the facility in South Padre Island in Brownsville, and they said, no, you have to have 2 weeks' notice, even though I said I'm on the subcommittee overseeing this agency. And I was in South Texas, but I gave them a week's notice. And when I saw on TV 2 weeks ago, we had 2 U.S. senators from Virginia refused to be able to go into a federal facility that was leased. But why would we ever have that? And our committee needs to know, why don't we have that ability to get
Would
there?
the gentleman yield just on that point really quick? That's a policy that's been in place since 2015. So it is, they told us down there it's about safety of the kids. These kids are being kept, you know, whether you just open the door, who shows up, they need some lead time. We had that.
Well,
We
I know
had that
members
for
of
our
Congress may
CODEL.
not be, but I think to an extent, maybe they ought to say, give a week's notice, because some weeks we don't know what we're doing but 2 weeks.
Sure.
And even though the policy's there, in 2015, I was actually in McAllen, and we visited a facility with both parents and children in the same facility.
Yeah,
So, but that's why our committee needs to have a hearing on this. I think that President Trump would come back to our senses and end this forcible separation of babies and children from mothers. Taking children from families is not an American tradition. We don't do that. And I think our country's got such a bad black eye internationally on what we're doing, and it makes me ill because I would not want to see my grandchildren separated from my children, or even where I couldn't go see them. So that's why I think our committee needs to have a hearing. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place my full statement in the record.
Without objection, of course.
I don't know if Ms. Clark wanted some time.
Thank you. Let me just add my voice to say that it is imperative that we have the HRES 982 inquiry. When I think about the fact that we have more questions than we have answers at this stage, it is just horrendous that the nation is going through this very heart-wrenching issue. Now, we've heard that a certain amount of these children, I believe you said it was over 50, are still, these are the children who are 5 years or younger, will not be returned to their parents. Well, I want to know what happens to these children. Are they becoming wards of the United States of America? What are we doing? This is just horrendous, and it speaks so horribly about this nation and what we stand for. We must have an inquiry, Mr. Chairman, and it should be bipartisan. It is important that we get every answer to every question, and we reunite these children with their parents. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I believe those children, just for the record, stay in ORR's responsibility, custody, and care until such time as they find a sponsor. Chair recognizes they work to find regular order. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Illinois to speak on the resolution for 5 minutes.
I am proud to support the resolution of Representative Pallone, and I thank him for offering it. I think that this episode will go down in history and be viewed at a moment where the United States of America was engaged in state-sanctioned child abuse and kidnapping. And I want to say that in the statement that was released both by the Attorney General and the Secretary of HHS, there are some quotes that say, warning people from other countries, do not risk your own life or the lives of your children attempting to enter the United States illegally. I want to comment on that because until the policies were changed, it was perfectly legal. The Statue of Liberty had her arms out, saying to people who were seeking asylum in the United States of America, which most of these families are doing, if not all of these families who are crossing the border, that it was perfectly legal. You could come to the United States of America, seek asylum, and what happened is that these asylum seekers would often have a bracelet put on their leg while they are awaiting adjudication of their case to prove that they had credible fear if they went back to their country. So when we talk about law, that has been the law of the United States of America. Never a question about taking these children away from their parents. Number two, I have a question about this report that we heard today about what has happened, that only 57 of the 103 children under age 5 have been returned in the so-called detailed report of why the others can't be returned. I was told when I visited a shelter in my district, this is a shelter that for 20 years has been taking children who are unaccompanied minors and now has children that have been separated from their parents as well, that there were a number of children, a number of parents who couldn't be identified because they had been deported, as mentioned here, and a number of children that couldn't be reunited with their parents because those parents had been released from custody and are somewhere in the United States of America. There's no mention of those parents right now. And I was told that both the deported and the released parents, that was a real challenge. That was a challenge to find them. I also know, as of today, there are still children in custody in these wonderful shelters run by the Heartland Institute that have not been reunited with their parents. They are being represented by counsel. And I doubt that they all fit into one of these categories that have been mentioned, that somehow their lives would be put in danger because the parents or relatives were ineligible. So I question this report that we've gotten. And I really resent the notion that even the chairman has said that they are coming here illegally. Maybe as of the zero tolerance policy, they're illegal, but this is an illegitimate policy that goes against 30 years of immigration law in our country. My own parents came here with their parents who were escaping the kind of discrimination and pogroms in Russia and seeked refuge in the United States of America. That's what we do. And that's why the Statue of Liberty welcomes those people to this country. And yes, there has to be a process, and we have had a process that makes sure that people who are at risk of their lives are able to stay here if they prove credible fear and never have their children. This is brand new. This is child abuse, this is kidnapping, and it is being done in our name. And I say on behalf of the vast majority of Americans, not in our name. And that's why this resolution is important, so that we resolve this issue
time has expired.
And save the children. I yield back.
Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. A number of my colleagues have alluded to this, but I'm just looking at this through the lens of our committee's responsibility and its jurisdiction. It's hard to imagine a topic that better warrants our having a hearing than this one. In other words, if you were explaining to somebody the jurisdiction of this committee and you wanted to give them an example of the kind of topic or issue that would call for and justify having a hearing, you'd give them this example. This would be Exhibit A. So this really goes to the kind of legitimacy of the way the committee operates in its area of jurisdiction. This is sort of a classic case of missing in action. It doesn't make any sense for us not to bring the head of HHS up here and other officials that are responsible for carrying out this policy and just ask them the questions that need to be asked. Yeah, some of those questions will be hard-edged, but we bring people up here all the time and ask them tough questions. about the areas of responsibility that they have. I can't explain it. I mean, I got constituents out there saying, well, what kind of hearings have you had, and what did the head of HHS say when they came to talk about this issue in front of your committee, which is the Energy and Commerce Committee and has the Health Subcommittee jurisdiction within it and has jurisdiction over HHS? What did the secretary say about the policy when he came to testify? And my answer has to be, well, we haven't had that hearing. And then the two of us just stand there and scratch our heads and try to figure out, well, how can that be? This falls squarely within the jurisdiction and responsibility and obligation of the committee. It's inexplicable that we won't notice a hearing on this topic at a time when it is the topic in the country, the topic on the Hill, bring the people who are responsible, and ask them the questions. And then, we can debate among each other whether one question's fair or not fair, whether we're overreaching, whether this document should be produced, or we do that on other things. We do that on things, frankly, that are much further removed from the immediacy or the application of our jurisdiction and from the immediacy of being a national concern than this is. And yet we find the time and the wherewithal to convene hearings on those topics and bring people in here and ask them serious questions about these issues. So I can't explain it. So I'm just going on the record for my constituents who keep asking me why we haven't had these hearings, that I can't explain that, and I haven't heard a good explanation yet for why we haven't been able to have a hearing. And I yield back my time.
I would think the toughest explanation is why you didn't join us on the bipartisan trip to the border.
Oh, come on.
That'd be the toughest one. Are there other members?
Many of us already went, Mr. Chairman.
But the committee offered the opportunity to everybody. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I'm a co-sponsor of Mr. Pallone's resolution of inquiry, and I strongly support efforts to require the Trump administration to provide to Congress all documents and communications associated with the administration's so-called zero-tolerance policy. We've all seen the consequences of this misguided policy. Children ripped out of their mother's arms, babies being held in chain-link cages, and sons and daughters who are so traumatized, so heartbreakingly, they can't even remember their parents upon reunification. It's hard to believe that these harrowing stories are happening today in the United States of America. It calls to mind mistakes from our nation's past that I thought we'd learned from. And what's almost more unbelievable is that all of this tragedy was completely avoidable and unnecessary to begin with. Asylum seekers from war-torn and violent countries with no other options will continue to flee their homes to protect their families, regardless of this policy. The only thing that's resulted from the administration's zero-tolerance policy is the dehumanization of immigrant families. The blame for the extreme mistreatment of these children and their parents lies squarely with President Trump and his administration. I've had the opportunity to visit a facility that ORR contracts with, where separated and unaccompanied children are being housed. My experience reaffirmed that we must reunite these children with their parents as quickly as possible. But it's also clear from my conversations with ORR and the facility staff there that HHS is not fully equipped to facilitate swift reunifications. While the agency faces some real obstacles that must be navigated carefully, the chaotic and disorganized process of these family separations has made reunification extremely challenging. The Department of Homeland Security tore many of these children from their parents without even documenting who their parents were or where they were being sent. The ORR contracted facility that I visited with was actually told by DHS that some of the children were unaccompanied as they crossed the border, when in fact they had been separated from their parents. The facility has had to identify these children as separated on their own and report that back to the administration that took them from the parents in the first place. This is completely unacceptable. How can we expect to solve this problem if the Trump administration can't even reliably identify which children need to be brought back to the parents in the first place? Congress has a responsibility to hold the President and his administration accountable for this disaster. And let me just say this. There were times in this country when Congress did not step up, did not have hearings, and did not take action or even listen. My parents were interned in a Japanese American internment camp. My father once said he believed that would not have happened if people in Congress stood up and said this was wrong. We cannot let this happen. Now, this is not quite the same thing, but I would say this. We owe a responsibility. The government did this. We have to find out why and where the children are going to be. That's up to us as Congress. We're elected. We're elected representatives of our constituents in this country, and it's up to us to really learn what happened. So we must support Mr. Pallone's resolution as a first step, and the resolution should be followed by genuine oversight by this committee. Thank you. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. Thank you, and I yield back.
Can I ask for the gentlewoman's
Yes.
time? Mr. Chairman, I just want to stress, I listened to what Ms. Matsui and Ms. Schakowsky said. The problem here is that we don't trust the government. I go home and people tell me, I don't trust the Trump administration. I don't trust the HHS. And that's the basic problem here. The reason we need to have hearings and the reason we need this resolution of inquiry, because people fundamentally have seen what the government of the United States has done in the past against the Japanese, in the history of slavery. I mean, look, the bottom line is we need to challenge the administration because we don't trust them. And that's a basic tenet here that I think maybe a lot of you on the other side don't understand. There's a lack of trust in the government.
Gentlelady's expired. Time's expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? We'll go now to the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word. I just want to follow up on Ms. Matsui's remarks on how this affects every family, or almost every family. My wife's grandfather was a political refugee from Mexico in 1917. He was marked for death, and his family was marked for death. My mother-in-law was marked for death. So they came to this country, they found refuge, and they found a good job. He became a good American, and now I think they're living good lives. And yet today, thousands of children yet to be reunited with their families. This president and this administration have created this mess, and it's our responsibility to hold them accountable. There's numerous questions that remain unanswered. For example, were there good records on what child was with what parent? What care did the child receive? How many children had medical conditions? What were the conditions and what were the treatments provided? Are there allegations of abuse? And how did this administration find a contractor to provide these kinds of services? I've sent numbers of letters to the Department of Health and Human Services and other agencies asking these questions, and I haven't received a single response. I urge my colleagues to support HRES 982 so that we can get to the bottom of what has happened and fulfill our responsibilities as members of Congress. I yield back.
Would you, gentleman, yield?
Gentleman, yield back. Are there other members seeking?
I asked the gentleman if he would yield to me.
Okay, I thought he yielded it back.
I thank the gentleman. I would just like to add something else here, and that is that I try to get into elementary schools, visit with students on a regular basis. I think it's important to. Civics classes are no longer taught. And there was a little one, first grader, that said, "Do you work for the president?" And, it's a profound question. And so, to the best of my ability, I brought it way down on the ground that the Constitution, the flag is the symbol of our nation, the Constitution is the soul of our nation, and no, members of Congress do not work for the president. We do not work for the president. And I'm thinking back over the years where there was bipartisanship. There was bipartisanship understanding the Constitution that neither side of the aisle works for the president. And I think at base, the resolution that is before us really calls on members to be working for the people of the United States and not be working for the president. I don't think that there should be one Republican or Democrat today that shouldn't be supporting this resolution to get to the bottom of this mess between agencies, but most importantly, the ones that we have jurisdiction over. This shouldn't be any partisan tug of war here. So, I'm thinking about that child that asked that question. Do you work for the president? And I think that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle should very quietly be asking themselves, am I working for the president? I yield back and thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, the newlywed on the committee, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I am sitting here and really going through some emotional crises because I'm hearing a lot of pain, past pain, from a number of members of this subcommittee. And I can readily identify with the pain that they're speaking to, that they're giving voice to, because I empathize and share that pain. Mr. Chairman, I want to remind us, members of this committee, that at one time in the history of our great nation, I was not even a person. I was a commodity that this committee had jurisdiction over. I was a part of the commerce of the nation. And now I sit as a member of Congress. Mr. Chairman, I say these things because you and I and other members of this committee have to always remember that there are dark demons that have not been eviscerated, that are still present in the history of our nation. And those demons right now are rearing their ugly, demonic head as we face this issue of how we are to deal with children of immigrants or those who aspire to be an American citizen. And Mr. Chairman, I want to please make note that I too am an immigrant, but I am not a voluntary immigrant. I am a forced immigrant of this nation. The son and grandson, the descendant of an ex-slave. And I can't, no matter how I might want, I don't even want to forget it. I always want to remember that that too is my American story. And what I see and hear of children being separated, once again, in the history of this nation, I cannot sit silent. and not speak up. Mr. Chairman, there are two enemies of the American people. And unless you and I and the rest of this committee and the rest of the members of Congress understand that these two very serious threats to the well-being of all of us as a people, then we can never attain the levels that we feel as though we were called to be. And those two enemies, one is silence. You and I, we cannot afford to be silent in the face of injustice. And this is the separation of these children is nothing more than gross injustice because it separates parents from families. The second enemy, Mr. Chairman, is inaction. Silence and inaction. We have to do something, and we have to do it now. I remind individuals from a point of history that there was, not too long ago, there were lynchings in our nation. Over 4,500 people were lynched in our nation. And the U.S. Congress tried over 200 times to pass laws outlawing lynching. And they never could, after 200 times, pass not one single law outlawing lynching. Why? Because there were a group of members of my party, Democrats, who represented the Deep South, who refused to allow legislation that had passed the House and the Senate to let it out of the Congress. Inaction. And that's what we are raising our voice against right now, is inaction. We hear all the words and all the phrases, but what do we do? What are we going to do? Your words
time has
speak
expired.
so loudly that I can hardly hear what you are saying, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has expired. Other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Vermont is recognized to strike the last word. Is that correct? 5 minutes.
It is. Thank you very much. It's quite moving to hear my colleagues with their stories, Ms. Matsui and her family, Jan Schukowski, and it's the American story. I happen to believe that we could be hearing from our Republican colleagues similar stories in their families. And Mr. Chairman, you indicated you took a bipartisan trip. I thank you for doing that. Several of us went on other trips. And I don't think there's any question that everybody in this committee is appalled at the notion of children being separated from their parents. The real question for us, I think, is what Congresswoman Matsui said. Find out why. That's our job. And Mr. Sarbanes talked about that. It is our job. This Congress is failing because we're not acting like an independent branch of government that's responsible for doing its share of maintaining checks and balances. That's a mutual obligation that we have, Republicans or Democrats, that it doesn't matter whether you're in the majority or the Democrats are in the majority. We have an independent Article I responsibility for oversight. And the question of why is a very valid, essential question. And the why begins at when and how this policy was implemented. I mean, this is the disgrace for me. The president, in the middle of April, made a decision for what was called zero tolerance. Now, that was a euphemism for taking kids from parents, because that's what it meant. And his argument for that was that it was going to be a deterrent for families trying to escape violence, and they would stay. And it was going to be a signal to people in this body that they weren't going to get their way on immigration and have kids, the dreamers, and these kids reunited with their families. unless we gave money for the wall. Now, number one, I think there is absolutely no justification, whatever your position is on immigration. There's contentious questions there, hard questions there. It is not legitimate to inject into the debate the fate of innocent children, whether they were dreamers brought here when they were 6 or 7 and are now serving in the military, serving as first responders, or these children who are brought up just recently and then separated from their parents. That's off limits. The president put them in play, and we should ask why. The second thing is, and this is the other why issue, if the president is going to implement this zero tolerance policy, does he not have some responsibility to coordinate activities with the governmental agencies that are charged with the execution of his policy? There was no opportunity for the men and women serving our country in DHS or in HHS to have a plan so that when the president's zero tolerance policy was implemented, we could track where this child was in relationship to his or her parent. There is no excuse for that, even if you say zero tolerance is something you can support, which I don't think anyone here really does. There's no excuse for the president, who has executive responsibility, not to do what an executive does, plan so the execution doesn't cause irreparable harm to kids. And the why question that Doris Matsui asked is the question the committee should be asking. That's the question. How is it that this policy was conceived, and how is it that there was no plan to implement it in a way that inevitably caused immense cruelty and harm to innocent children? That's our job, to find out the why. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I again would join Mr. Welch in acknowledging the remarks of our colleagues, Mr. Rush and Ms. Matsui, Ms. Schakowsky, Mr. McNerney, for those very personal stories that they shared with us. And Mr. Chairman, I would also join Mr. Welch in saying thank you to you and to our Republican colleagues that did go on that visit, and Mr. Schrader for joining that trip as well. But that shouldn't go in the face of not acknowledging that other colleagues have also gone on the trip. The importance of our oversight responsibilities as well. I don't believe a slight was intended. I know of your good character, Mr. Chairman, and what we're hoping to do here is make sure that we're able to bring back all those findings, all the observations, the conversations that we had with HHS, the conversations that were had with ORR staff within HHS, the children, the parents, the moms, the dads, and bring that back into the people's house and have a conversation and a hearing. And I don't know if, has a hearing been scheduled? And I would yield to the chair.
There's no.
I'm sorry, John.
There's no hearing been scheduled.
I appreciate that, Mr. Yield. I would yield to Mr. Green.
I found out that an email for the trip was delivered on Sunday, July the 1st to my office, and that was the beginning of our week break. And like I said, the week before, I called, my office called and tried to get me to be able to get into the Brownsville location, and even the one that's in my district on Interstate 10, you had to have 2 weeks' notice. And I don't think the committee got 2 weeks' notice when they went. So that's something I think I'd like to hear about the hearing, whether we have these vague dates that they decide you can't come but 2 weeks.
If the gentleman just would yield.
I would yield.
Just on the response, I'm being told by committee staff that the initial invitation was the Friday after we left on the Thursday evening. we're all going to debate times and dates, but I think there was a little sooner notification.
To the point of Mr. Green's question as well, did the committee give the facilities 2 weeks' notice?
I am instructed that we did.
I appreciate that, Mr. Shimkus. Well, the other thing that I'd point out, Mr. Chairman, is the importance of the oversight hearings are to make sure that we're able to ask questions and ask questions about discrepancies. I think that the committee staff is fully aware, because they're comprehensive in what they do, that if you look at the report filed on the 10th of July that highlights what HHS said that was their assessment and their analysis, if you look at page 1, line 22 or 23, depending on how this is printed, they talk about 102 children. And then they give other numbers in here associated with the report. When you look at the press release that came out on July 12th, it says there were 103 children. And then the numbers are different. Press release from HHS, court document and a report submitted by HHS, and the numbers don't match up. I think that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of here, and make sure that we're asking these questions. And I just don't understand why, after the progress that was made in a bipartisan way in this committee last week with the leadership of Ms. Blackburn, which was an important amendment that the committee agreed to, why then the committee would reject the resolution that's being put forth by Mr. Pallone, which I think builds upon the importance of getting this information back. And the last thing that I would say, Mr. Chairman, is voting no on Mr. Pallone's resolution sends the signal to the American people that voting no means that the committee is satisfied with Secretary Azar's claims that the Trump administration's actions have been treating these kids fairly or comprehensively, and we all know that that's not the case. So I hope that we might be able to join Mr. Pallone in adopting this resolution, and that this committee may be able to report to the American people and to each of us that a hearing has been scheduled on this issue, so that we can make sure that our calendars are free and available to be part of that important hearing. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and just in response, we will ask that question of the 102 and 103 difference, and that's why we've also asked for a trip to the Special Operations Center, which is the Tactical Operations Center up here in D.C.
Chairman yield?
I will.
Mr. Chairman, why not have those questions asked right here in the committee? I think that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair hears the gentleman's questions. Who seeks time? Gentleman from New York, what do you seek recognition for?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in strong support of H.R. 982. This resolution would provide Congress with critically needed information regarding the irreparable harms currently being inflicted on children as a result of President Trump's cruel family separation policies. President Trump manufactured this crisis when his administration forcibly separated at least 2,300 plus children from their parents. Many of the migrant population were pushed out of their homelands by violence and strife and sought shelter in the United States through the legal avenue of asylum. They were drawn north by the strength that defines America across the world. But instead of our strength, we gave them our fear, we gave them our weakness, and we took their children. In response to this unimaginable cruelty, the American people have spoken loudly and made their voices heard. Through calls and emails to my office from individuals across the political spectrum, I've heard one resounding message over and over, that we are not a nation that stands for this president's inhumane separation of families. Unfortunately, despite the public outcry, this tragedy continues. Too many children remain separated from their families with no end in sight. Neither the president nor this Republican Congress seem to have a sense of urgency to restore those children to their parents or to serve as a check and balance. These are not the actions of a great nation, nor of a people who believe in strength of family. This must end, and it must end now. A just society, a civil society, the American society doesn't do this to children and families. We can take action today to keep this administration's feet to the fire, to do the right thing and swiftly reunite these families. If we vote no on this resolution today, we're choosing to bury our heads in the sand and ignore the grave injustice continuing to unfold before our very eyes. If we vote no today, we are choosing to ignore the tender cries of children who yearn simply to be with their parents. If we fail to take action today, we will be complicit in this heinous policy and this dark chapter in our American history. With that, I urge my colleagues to do the right thing, the just thing, and the moral thing by voting yes. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose did the Chairman Emeritus seek recognition?
Strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to take a time out of this and speak about something a little bit happier. We have a colleague here that got married about 2 weeks ago. He's apparently just gotten back from his honeymoon. He seems smiling. I'd like to congratulate the Honorable Bobby Rush of Chicago for his recent marriage and wish his wife condolences for having to put up with you for the rest of your natural-born life. So. I'm engaged, but I haven't yet got my fiance to commit to a specific date. But I'm hoping to emulate the Honorable Rush sometime in the very foreseeable.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say those remarks from my good friend from Texas, I've recorded them, and I'm going to replay them again as soon as you say I do.
And then on the issue at hand, Mr. Chairman, there's strong emotions on both sides on this. A number of the members of the committee just came back from the border. I believe Congressman Schrader was the only one from the minority side that was able to make the trip. Those of us that saw firsthand what's happening, I didn't see any personally, I didn't see any abuse of any children or family members. Doesn't mean it hadn't happened, but the Border Patrol people, the ICE people, the Customs people, you know, we're in a difficult situation because of this policy. If they come across the border and they actually get onto American soil and they claim a credible fear under our law and our precedents, they are entitled to go before a federal magistrate for a hearing to determine the authenticity of that claim. Because of the backlog, it takes 2 to 5 years, and about half of them don't show up for the hearing, but those that do have a right to automatic appeal, and then they can appeal if they lose that. So totally legally, once they get physically present on the United States soil, even if they come across illegally and their claim is illegitimate, they can stay in this country by making that claim up to 15 years. And if you're an adult male and have a biological child, because in the entirety of the United States, we have 84 beds to handle adult males with children. There's an 84-bed facility in Pennsylvania. They are being let go on personal recognizance within an average of 1 to 2 days after they physically are present and it's been determined that the child with them is their child. So we're letting now 300 people, 300 men and their children a day into the country. They've come illegally, but they're being allowed legally. And this policy, you know, we want to protect the rights for people to seek asylum in the United States because of we are the haven of the world, as the Congresswoman from Illinois pointed out earlier. But we're allowing that legitimate principle to be manipulated by people that really don't have that kind of a case. And that's something we need to address as a Congress, if not in this Congress, in the next Congress. But with
Mr.
that,
Chairman, gentleman yield
if I have time.
for
Gentleman from
39
Texas.
seconds.
Sure.
Joe, our committee, we think we have broad jurisdiction, but we really don't have jurisdiction over immigration policies. It's Judiciary Committee. And, but our jurisdiction does cover Health and Human Services.
It does.
It's the agency that's overseeing these children.
That's correct.
And that's why it's a jurisdiction of our committee to see why are we in the middle of this. It's a worldwide embarrassment. And, but, you know, we'll let the judiciary take care of the immigration law.
I just simply, you know, I support the concept. I will not vote for the gentleman from New Jersey's, I don't know if it's a bill or a petition or what, but I support.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks time? Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes, striking the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I did get a chance to go to the border this past weekend, and it was an eye-opener, I think, for everybody on the trip. Many of us had not gone prior to this, and it's a little jarring. You get down there, despite the best intentions of our Border Patrol folks, Port of Entry folks, and the folks trying to take care of the kids. It looked pretty bleak. Seeing these kids in these big cyclone cages in the middle of a warehouse. I mean, that's just not what I think of when I think of this country. I go to the Port of Entry, and the folks there are struggling to find rooms, very small rooms in this 1953 cinder block building. I mean, it's kind of tough. And, I think everyone wants that to change, wants to do something different. It was clear in talking to the folks down there that they were caught pretty much unawares with a lot of the policies and a lot of the statements coming out of the administration. Despite their ability or attempts to triage it, it's hard to put all that together, kind of on the fly by running this whole operation almost by the seat of their pants. And they're facing overwhelming odds. The cartels profit off of these families and these children. They encourage this stuff. We are missing the boat, I think, in terms of, working with some of these countries, trying to stop the problem before it gets here. We should be working with these families back in Guatemala, and Honduras and El Salvador, and we're not doing that. I think that these are the types of things that we could be working on and making a significant difference in the lives of these individuals going forward. We have some policies I'd like to see Congress, step up and begin to deal with. There was some discussion about, the OR budget, the CBP budget. Where's that money actually going? Frankly, we had several folks tell us they have less money now than they used to, and that was surprising and I think pretty problematic from our standpoint. It was alluded to and talked about here that with the court-mandated timelines, these families don't get due process. It does take years and years and years maybe for them to get resolution, and that's a horrible way to live in that purgatory for that period of time. I just think, again, we could probably step in and with some funds make a difference there. Those facility, you get to the detention centers and it's not a prison, they tell you, but gosh, it sure looks kind of like one. And we met some of the women there, and one woman was actually had been in America for quite a while and lost her children because she had an old DUI. And I don't think that's the intention of what we're trying to do here in this country. And I'm concerned the administration is turning a blind eye to this and actually going back and trying to denaturalize a lot of American citizens or American folks that have come here over a long period of time. So, and criminal history could include that. So if they're not getting their children that because of cool criminal history, that might be what they're using. I'd just like to see us step up. I'm tired of having the judges and the administrations of this country run amok when it's our duty to step in and fix this resettlement refugee program and make sure these children get a fair shake. I would hope that we'd actually have, legislation and some hearings and move things forward and show America, show the rest of the world that that we care, that we actually care, and put these children, these families in appropriate settings that, as was talked about by my good friend from Texas, so they are in short supply. And if we can do it, at least that would be a huge improvement. So I appreciate the opportunity to go on the trip, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much. And hopefully we can step up.
Would the gentleman yield? I
Yes, sir.
appreciated him going on the trip, and a lot of what you've recounted there just was, I think, shocking to all of us, especially at that border crossing where they told us it's the 53 building, but last updated 1983, and they don't have enough electric current to have a magnetometer there or whatever it is to screen people for devices. They would, even if they had one, they don't have enough power in the building. So we got that, by the way, that's outside of our jurisdiction, but not outside of our jurisdiction as members of Congress. So these are issues we saw firsthand that need to be addressed. I thank the gentleman from yielding. Are there members on this side of the aisle seeking recognition? The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. And I'm a father of 4, grandfather of 6. Prior to being elected to Congress, I worked down on the southern border in El Paso for a while. Now, obviously, the situation back in 2006 was very different than it is today. I relate to many of the comments of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The concern for the children, I share that. I think it's been mentioned several times on both sides. No one, and I think you said it earlier, Mr. Chairman, no one on this committee wants to see children separated from their family. But we have an immigration crisis. It's not just a children being separated from their family crisis. We have an immigration crisis. And it starts with our inability to secure our border and handle these situations the right way. And it's a situation that is long overdue for a solution. But what we're hearing here today, what concerns me, is a very one-sided accusation that somehow this is a manufactured crisis, and that we have not done our duty. Mr. Schrader just pointed out, he said he was tired of having judges make these calls. I agree with that. I think Congress should act. And what frustrates me and what concerns me is that a couple of weeks ago, we started to try to act. We had 2 comprehensive immigration bills on the House floor, and not one single member from the other side of the aisle supported nor came to the table for discussions about
the gentleman
those.
yield?
No, I will not. You guys have had plenty of time to chat already.
We'll have a supermajority,
No.
Mr. Johnson. You
No,
couldn't pass it either.
I did not yield, Mr. Lujan. I did not yield.
Regular order, we need to hear each other.
So here's my concern. It's easy to sit in the confines of a hearing room like this and point fingers. And we've been silent for the most part. But where were you guys 2 weeks ago when we tried to address comprehensive immigration reform? Nobody came to the table. So if you want to be serious, rather than politicizing this issue, roll up your sleeves, come to the table, and let's have a substantive discussion about immigration reform that starts with securing the border and then addressing those that have come here, whether legally or illegally, and address the problem in total context. I think it's disingenuous to make it a one-side argument that this is some kind of manufactured crisis. If you want to be a part of the solution, then come to the table. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Gentleman from Massachusetts, I think, is next. Mr. Kennedy is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the comments that have been made on both sides of the aisle. Let's try to get some facts straight. One, I do agree, and I take everybody at their word, that there's not a member of this dais that approves of a zero-tolerance policy. I also think we have to acknowledge the fact that the zero-tolerance policy came from somewhere, and that the Trump administration initially denied that there was a policy, finally conceded there was a policy, and members of the White House indicated that it was a policy meant for deterrence. So somebody thought this was a good idea. Somebody thought it up, and they thought it was a good idea. So we can't whitewash that away, one. Two, there has been information that has come out. My colleagues have pointed out that that information has been the result of lawsuits that have come forward, not oversight and hearings. Three, there have been unifications. I met with a woman in Boston after, yes, I went down to El Paso, Texas with some colleagues, and I was denied entry. I met with a woman who presented herself at the border for asylum in Santa Teresa. She was separated from her child. Her claim was investigated. She was found to have a credible claim for asylum because of domestic violence back in Brazil. She was released. Her boy was not. They found out where her child was through a Facebook page. That child, after weeks and another lawsuit, was finally released by ORR to Mom's Arms because of another lawsuit. So let's be clear here about what is the driving force around the reunification of these kids. It clearly is not Congress. To that end, a journalist just posted on social media that she asked HHS and ICE officials about info on a child under 5 in government custody who was separated from their parent over a year ago. And authorities believe that both parent and child might be a U.S. citizen. Silence from administration officials. I'm not sure if this is right. She's not sure if this is right. But it is reason to ask questions and have some oversight as to what these policies are, because clearly this policy was put in place before anybody ever thought for a second about how to reunify a family, because they're making it up on the fly. And for those of you that believe that comprehensive immigration reform is an issue and that we should be working on it, I wholeheartedly agree. Next time you want to try to do it, maybe you shouldn't try to do it inside a Republican caucus room. Maybe invite us to the table. Maybe acknowledge the fact that in 2013, there was a veto-proof majority, Democrats and Republicans, that came out with an immigration bill out of the U.S. Senate, and we couldn't get a vote on it on the floor in this chamber. So let's be clear about what the driving issue on this policy is. Let's be clear, if we want to actually separate it, a border wall isn't going to stop people fleeing destitution and poverty and gang violence from coming to our country. When I was down on the border, I met with a person who runs a shelter who had been in contact with a grandmother from Guatemala who had fled to the border with her grandchild because her husband had been taken out of their home, had both of his legs cut off by a machete, and his body riddled with bullets. Her child and her child's spouse and their 3 kids were burned alive in a home. So she picked up a granddaughter and fled to our border. You're not going to solve that grandmother from fleeing with a grandchild because you build a border wall. You're going to solve it because you actually take these issues seriously, you see the humanity in people that are fleeing that violence, and you try to address those concerns in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Mexico. And you know what the response of this administration has been? According to CRS, they've cut aid to Latin America by 20%. So let's be very clear about how you actually try to solve this problem. Tearing babies from parents' arms ain't going to do it. Building a border wall ain't going to do it. Cutting aid to these countries ain't going to do it. You want to actually solve the problem? I'm all in. But don't hide behind obfuscation and court orders and hearings to then say that we're actually trying to solve this when this is an issue that has stressed Democratic administrations and Republican ones. This is a complex issue. I have traveled with my Republican colleagues down to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador on a Republican-sponsored CODEL. These are hard issues, but let's address them like this Congress should and not try to hide behind a policy that we're now trying to say wasn't put in place in the first place. Yield back.
Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair recognize. Oh, I'm sorry. We got to go back up here. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes to strike the last
Thank you,
word.
Mr. Chairman. And I think I've said as much as I wanted to by using my colleague's time, but Chairman Shimkus knows I'll get every minute I can get, and maybe more. But Congressman Johnson, I'd love to sit down and work out an immigration reform bill, but that's not in our committee. I don't want to serve on the Judiciary Committee. But to blame Democrats that the Republicans couldn't agree themselves to get a majority vote on their immigration bill is not our fault. It's not this committee's fault either. But I'm just embarrassed because for our whole country and what we see around the world is people being torn from their families, children taken from them. And it amazes me that a parent had been deported, that they didn't know that there was a child in custody. If they're deported to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, or even Mexico, it's our responsibility to get that parent back to be the custodial for that child. Somewhere along the way, it looked like Keystone Cops was taking over our detention facilities. And that's when HHS comes in, it is our jurisdiction. When they are required by law to take custody of those children, there needs to be some kind of identifying relationship. And this is not new law. What's happened is that the current administration is not enforcing the law as it's supposed to be, and it's cutting corners. And that's what's wrong. So that's why I think we need to have a hearing with our Health and Human Services Secretary. It's not his fault. We got it. Now let's see how we can fix it. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to my colleague from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Green. And Mr. Barton's observation, I appreciate that, but with seeing the children, but I wanted to remark what health experts are saying across America. And the medical community, including pediatricians, psychiatrists, public health experts, emergency physicians, and nurses all over the country have weighed in to say that these children are at risk for long-term health effects. That includes mental health issues like depression, anxiety, developmental delays, substance use disorder, and even physical illness. Even the State Department recently published a report. And in that, it said even at their best, residential institutions are unable to meet a child's need for emotional support that is typically received from family members or consistent caretakers with whom the child can develop an attachment. It's not just what you see, it's what you don't. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we do bring in HHS and ORR into a committee hearing, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you might be able to tell us when we might be able to schedule that hearing, especially before the August recess.
Gentleman at yield. I would just, I'm sorry, it's actually the gentleman from Texas's time.
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to work with our colleagues on the side to solve this problem, and that's what our committee does, particularly on our jurisdiction. And I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman, if not, gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the last word.
Yes, on my time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to repeat the question from my colleague from New Mexico regarding when could we have a hearing, and hopefully before the August break?
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes, to the chairman.
We are in the process of doing the investigative work we do leading up to hearings that may or may not occur. Again, part of that involved a bipartisan trip to the border. I appreciate my colleague from Texas's comments about the jurisdiction of this committee, because while we're all passionate about what's happened down there, we want these children reunited.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The issue is we have this narrow slice of this HHS piece on ORR.
Thank you, reclaiming my time. I think I understand your answer, Mr. Chairman. I got the gist about when we may have that hearing. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. With the remaining time that I have left, what I'd like to do for the benefit of the American public, because what we are having here today is an open hearing of the Energy and Commerce Committee before the public of the world and certainly the American public. So I just want to read the resolution that the ranking member Pallone has introduced. and that you, Mr. Chairman, said that you do not support this resolution, H.R. 982, of inquiry requesting the President and directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services to transmit, respectively, certain information to the House of Representatives referring to the separation of children from their parents or guardians as a result of the President's zero-tolerance policy. Resolved that the President is requested and the Secretary of Health and Human Services is directed to transmit, respectively, to the House of Representatives not later than 14 days after the date of the adoption of this resolution, copies of all documents, memoranda, advisory, legal opinions, notes from meetings, audio recordings, records, including telephone and electronic mail records, correspondence, and other communications, or any portion, any such communications, to the extent that any such one or more items are within the possession of the President of the Secretary, respectively, and refer to the following. 1, the health and welfare of children forcibly separated from their parents or guardians as a result of the President's zero-tolerance policy. 2, the long-term implications of the President's zero-tolerance policy on the health of children described in paragraph 1. I haven't heard anyone say that this is not within our jurisdiction. I think we can agree to that because this is all under HHS, and the resolution speaks to what's within our jurisdiction. That having been said, I will say that Trump has caused this internment camp policy, and he refuses to stop. Many of my colleagues have spoken to the checks and balances and the responsibility of Congress, and unless we have true and honest hearings before the public with the proper highest level officials that we can call forth before this committee, we are abdicating our duties and we are failing the American public. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that when the chairman described and colored his comment that too bad that the Democrats didn't necessarily take up the chairman and this committee on going to one of the facilities in Texas just this past weekend, I want to remind all of us that dozens and dozens of Democrat members of Congress have gone to facilities, both on the border and interior facilities, as a result of this zero-tolerance policy coming to our attention and to the attention of the American people. So I just want to state for the record, yes, one Democrat did go on a short notice event. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having approximately 6 members of the Republican caucus to go. That's nice. But at the same time, there has been much going on for months now that we were aware of, and it's good to see that some members are finally acting on the opportunity to see for themselves. Speaking of seeing for themselves, I went to the border in California, the border of California and Mexico, and saw some facilities for myself. My wife went with me, and so did 13 other members of Congress, all Democrats, by the way, and we were received well by the officials who allowed us to see the facilities, et cetera. They did tell us, no, you can't talk to the children, you can't talk to the adults, et cetera, and things of that nature. There were some things that we were able to clarify that they told us verbally that were not true, and by the end of the trip, they corrected themselves in some cases and told us that, yes, they were wrong and they corrected themselves. So that visit did have some, not only foreseeing for ourselves, but actually getting some of the facts on the record. But the facts on the record should be brought before the public in front of this committee, I say. In addition to that, I want to thank my wife who got inspired to go again, and she said, let's go to Texas. We're going to help Sister Norma, help some of the people who have been fortunate enough to be released in McAllen, Texas. I said, no, Norma. My wife, Norma, I said, I have to go to do my work in Washington. You go. So she went without me. So my point is this. It's great to see that some people have been inspired to see for themselves, but the fact of the matter, it is only the members of Congress who've been elected, duly elected, to have hearings before the people of the public, and the only person who can make that happen is you, Mr. Chairman. I hope and pray that we have those hearings as soon as possible. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I yield to the chair.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to make sure it's well understood in terms of our official trip from this committee to the border. It was, I believe, open to anyone on the committee. Democrats made that choice. Your staff knew and could work that out with you, and we wish others could have come. Look, we understand, you know, there's notice issues in terms of timing, and people had other commitments in their lives. But let me be clear, the choice on who came on the Democrat side was up to your leadership. And so I thought it was important to have a bipartisan, and it was, official trip of this committee well organized, where we could ask these questions and see the facilities firsthand. And I commend the members of the committee who have done this on their own. That's good. I do not take anything wrong with that. I don't. I think that's healthy. I think it always helps to see firsthand. Now, to the point, we share many of these same concerns, if not all. And in fact, the letter that we made available for both sides of the aisle to sign, that we sent to the Secretary June 29th from this committee, and again, only for whatever set of reasons, the Democrats did not choose to sign this letter. That's your decision. You sent your own. That's fine. But let me go through the questions we have posed to the Secretary. This is part of the fact-finding process that we do on this committee. And letters matter. Letters are important. To assist the committee in its efforts, please provide written answers to the following questions, as well as the requested documents no later than July 20th, 2018. 1, how many unaccompanied UACs, children, are in ORR custody as of June 29th, 2018? A, how many UACs have been placed in ORR custody as of June 29th as a result of being separated from their parents or families? What's the age range of UAC in ORR custody as of June 29th? What documentation or information does ORR receive when a UAC is transferred by DHS to ORR custody? Does that documentation or information change depending on whether the child was separated from a family or across the border alone? Is there a formal process to determine whether UAC has been separated from someone who is legitimately their parent and or reuniting parents and children who have been separated? If so, please describe the process. How many UACs have been placed into ORR custody have been reunited with a family member from whom they were separated? What is the role of the task force established by ASPR? How is this task force working with other HHS agencies or other federal agencies? 5, what is the maximum number of UAC that ORR can have in custody at any given point? Please provide a breakdown of how much of that capacity is permanent, in flux, or temporary facilities. Does ORR have the resources to properly house and care for this high number of unaccompanied children being transferred to their custody? 6, how does ORR determine which facility a child is sent to upon entering ORR custody? Is age a factor? Are siblings kept together? 7, what steps is ORR taking to track and address issues of abuse within HHS-funded facilities, including but not limited to significant incident reports? What oversight does HHS or ORR conduct of HHS-funded facilities, including but not limited to site visits, reviews, or audits of the facilities? 8, what medical screenings for communicable or other diseases does ORR or its grantees conduct? 9, what types of medications is ORR authorized to administer? Or does ORR authorize grantee to administer to unaccompanied children, including but not limited to antibiotics, vaccinations, psychotropic drugs? 10, how does ORR identify an appropriate sponsor for a UAC? Since January 1 of 2014, how many unaccompanied children have been placed with a parent, relative, or unrelated adult? Please provide the number per category. How often is ORR unable to identify a Category 1, 2, or 3 sponsor? What happens in those situations? B, under what circumstances would ORR remove an unaccompanied child from a sponsor? In those situations, what happens after an unaccompanied child is removed from a sponsor? 12, please provide all policies and procedures since January 1 of 2014 regarding the care of unaccompanied children while in ORR custody. 13, please provide all policies and procedures since January 1, 2014 regarding the placement of an unaccompanied child with a sponsor, reunification of a UAC with a family if separated. 14, please provide copies of all contracts or grant agreements since January 1, 2014 between the Department of any of its divisions and private companies to house UAC. And finally, please provide all significant incident reports or other documents that relate to allegations of abuse of children in the care or custody of ORR from January 1, 2017 to the present. And I think that is the letter that we sent, Republicans sent. You all could have signed it. You sent your own. That's fine. I think we're all after the same information. And believe me, we share a common commitment that these children be safely cared for appropriately. With that, my time has expired.
I guess my time has expired, but I just want to add that I'm looking forward to the answers to that and proceed from there. Thank you.
And we are due to get a response by July 20th, according to the letter. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you
to speak on the resolution.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for reading your letter. Thank you for taking the trip. to the border, but simply is not a substitute for hearings here where they're publicly televised and the American public can tune in and understand everything they say is on the record. If they're in the oversight subcommittee, they're under oath. The committee has a very significant responsibility, and you shouldn't shirk it. I don't know what you're afraid of. We should be working together on this very serious, horrendous policy of ripping children away from their parents. And at this time, I'll yield the balance of the time to Mr. Pallone.
I want to thank the gentlewoman for yielding, and let me ask again that I urge all my colleagues to support the resolution, both on the Democratic and the Republican side. I was glad that Mr. Cardenas actually read the resolution, because if you see in the last two paragraphs, which are really the key to it, a lot of it refers specifically to the zero-tolerance policy. And a lot of my Democratic colleagues today have pointed out that this is all the result of the zero-tolerance policy by President Trump. And we need to get to the bottom of that policy as it affects these children and as it affects what HHS is doing. So I really want to make 2 points. One is we still need this resolution. Yes, the chairman asked some questions. Yes, we've asked a lot of questions. Yes, the secretary had a conference call, and the secretary has talked to me privately as well. But in none of those things did we actually get answers, meaningful answers, as to what this zero-tolerance policy was all about, why it resulted in the separation of children from their families, and what has happened to those children since, and what's going to happen to them in the future. Because the fact of the matter is, there was never a way to track these children. There was never a way to even find out which parents they were associated with. And that's the reason why it is so difficult now for the secretary, because I believe he's well-intentioned, to bring these children back together with their parents. They didn't track them. They didn't have a means of communications. That's what happens when those of us who met with the families find that out. And, you know, that policy, in my opinion, stunk from the very beginning, and there was no effort to really worry about the consequences for the kids, and we certainly don't want it to happen again. And the second thing is, I think my colleagues on the Democratic side brought out very effectively as to why we need hearings. It doesn't matter that the secretary is well-intentioned. It doesn't matter that HHS has actually, gotten back to us and talked to us and tried to answer our questions, because they haven't been able to do it. And they need to be challenged at a hearing of this committee to say, why did this happen? Why haven't you done it? What are you going to do to change things so these kids are put back in place with their families? So I just want to urge my colleagues. I know we've had a very good discussion here today. The bottom line is we still don't have the answers. We still don't have anything coming from the chairman of the Republican side telling us how we're going to get these answers. And the only thing that's going to make that happen is if we start down the road of demanding, through formal action of this committee, through this resolution, that we find those answers and then have a hearing. And so once again, Mr. Chairman, I did hear you say at one point, I don't think I misunderstood, I think you said that, your questions might lead to a hearing, that we might have a hearing down the road. I would ask that that hearing be done soon. I ask that it be done before the August recess, while all this is very much fresh in our minds. I think there was a little effort on your part to suggest that that might happen, although you didn't commit to it. But I would ask you again, based on what happened today, based on our conversations, based on the comments that were made by my colleagues, it is clear to me that we need that hearing. And I don't think that we're going to get answers quickly enough from HHS unless we have the hearing. So hopefully you'll follow through, and we will have a hearing before this committee. And I yield back to my colleague from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one question. Are you saying and making a firm statement before the committee this morning that if you don't get a response by July 20th, then you will proceed to hold a hearing?
No, you didn't hear that. The gentleman yield. I don't recall saying that at all. If the gentlelady, I think, actually controls the time, Is it okay to you? Yeah. So what I said, Mr. Rush, is that our letter requested answers from the agency by July 20th. And I think in virtually every letter we send as a committee, whether it's partisan or bipartisan, we put a date when we want answers. We put that date, and we expect to get answers from HHS by July 20th. In the meantime, we took the trip to the border, and other members have gone, and so we're doing our work. And anybody on the Democrat side could have gone. So it's the gentlelady's time's expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. DeGette.
Thank you very much for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I just want to follow up on the conversations we've been having about this resolution and about this committee's jurisdiction, because I think the reason why everyone on this side of the aisle is so impassioned about this and so concerned is because we're all frankly shocked at the fact that apparently these children were taken from their parents, put into the custody of HHS under ORR, and then it's been virtually impossible to get these kids reunited with their parents. And the thing we're so concerned about, and the reason why time is of the essence, as we know, as we've seen from this last week, the longer time goes by, the harder it's going to be to achieve this reunification. And we find it, frankly, incredible that the greatest country in the world could take away roughly 3,000, could separate roughly 3,000 families, and then HHS apparently could not figure out which children belonged with which parents. And that's why we're so concerned. And I just want to say, I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you writing the letter to the Secretary, to Secretary Azar, asking all of those questions. A number of us have also written letters. There's a letter dated June 20th, June 28th, and July 6th, all three letters that I have personally signed. There are also two other letters that Mr. Pallone has signed on behalf of the committee Democrats, dated June 14th and June 26th. And Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to put all of those letters in the record so that Mr. Azar can also answer those questions as we continue our committee's investigation.
Of course, without any objection.
Thank you very much. And then one last thing that I would just like to say, and I say this with some pain, is I don't think it's fair, Mr. Chairman, to say to the Democrats on this committee that somehow we're not allowed, or to imply that we're not allowed to have concern or objection if we didn't go on your CODEL down there to the border. Many of us went on other CODELs where we saw the exact same thing and where we've looked at it. And I did get a clean copy of the itinerary that I went on Saturday, June 23rd. As well as the things on that itinerary, several of us also went to one of the tender age facilities that is being administered by ORR, and we also went to the border in Brownsville and we talked to the families there. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put that itinerary in the record as well.
Absolutely, without objection.
Thank you. And again, as somebody who has been a member of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee for 11 terms now, and who is now the ranking Democrat, it's never been a barrier to having an investigation or a hearing to tell members that they had to go to the places that we're talking about. And I don't think that that's a very fair argument to us. I think that what we should do—
Would the gentlelady yield?
In a minute. I think that what we should do is that we should finish our investigation as quickly as we can, because there are still thousands of kids who haven't been reunited with their families. We should have a hearing before the August recess, and we can see what we can do to get HHS to actually take the actions to reunite these kids with their parents. And I believe it's Mr. Doyle's time. If he'd like to yield to, he can.
Yeah, and I'll be glad to yield to the chair if he wants time.
I just want to clarify, because it was imputed that somehow I was trying to say that if you didn't go on the official trip from the committee, you didn't have a voice. That is never anything I believe. I did not say that. I do not believe that. My point in making the issue of the trip was that the committee is taking official action to go to the border, and we wanted to make sure people had the opportunity to go, because just as you went to the border, just as you sent letters, others did, we're better informed whether we go individually or as a committee. And we wanted to make that available to people, and that's why we did it as soon as we could possibly arrange it.
Okay, I yield back.
Just for, and I will go to the gentleman from Cal, just for purposes of committee functionality, they're going to have votes on the House floor at 1:05. With that, I'd recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a new problem. We've never faced this as a country before. Children of families seeking asylum, however they've crossed the border, have never been separated from safe parents before. Families have been kept together. We have had alternative to detention programs where nearly 100% success rate for showing up for their court cases. The change is, one, that these alternatives to detentions were indiscriminately ended with no hearings or no discussion. Two, the zero tolerance policy led to this separation for deferment and intimidation reasons. So this administration's new cruel and inhumane policy and practice has separated over 2,000 children from their parents, causing children to suffer from long-term health effects such as toxic stress, psychological, and irreversible trauma. Toxic stress occurs when a child experiences strong and repetitive or prolonged adversity without the comfort of their mother or father calming them down or helping them cope with such stress. This can disrupt their brain development at a critical moment where their brain is still forming, increasing their future risk of emotional and physical health problems like heart disease, diabetes, depression, suicide. These children may have difficulty learning in schools, severe separation anxiety, and have difficulty interpreting comforting actions because their brains aren't wired to accept them. They have difficulty forming and accepting long, secure, stable, loving relationships, and they will be now at risk for always having dysfunctional relationships. They will be at higher risk of depression, substance abuse, and will have a harder time being, as I mentioned, in stable, loving relationships. And the scary part about this is that the more intense the traumatic experience or the longer this lasts, the more intense their symptoms and the higher chances of them having a irreversible long-term problem increases. So this is a matter of urgency that we need to deal with today, yesterday, in fact. And these are the three things that we as a committee need to really, really do. And as individuals, as a country, in fact, the first thing we need to do is we need to end the stress. In other words, reunite the children with their parents safely so that their parents can comfort and start to build that parental relationship again to help the children cope. Two, get them out of cages and put them into a stable, secure environment where a family can start to come back into a normal family routine. Three, provide the mental and medical care that the children need. I am so glad that you asked some questions in your letter, Mr. Chairman, that addresses that. And the further questions that I would like to ask in an open committee hearing is, how many mental health providers are there per child's needs? Two is, when these children were separated with haste from their mother's arms, did they take a medical history? Do we know about any nutritional requirements? Do we know if there are any fatal allergic reactions to medications? Because without having that information, the providers can accidentally or give them an antibiotic that can kill the child. The other thing that we need to do is to provide this, not only therapy for this child, but that reunification. Is that happening when these families are being reunited? I have about 30 seconds, and I'm sure you can address this soon afterwards. But my point is that we demand access to information related to the health and welfare of these children, as well as the long-term care that they're going to require. And we can all agree, listen, regardless of your political affiliation or opinion on immigration policy, we can all agree that the well-being of a child is what is most important. And this is not about politics. This is about decency. This is about human dignity. And the administration must work harder to reunify these children with their parents and get them the medical, mental, and social services that they need to recover from this new
Gentleman's time's
severe
expired.
psychological trauma.
Just for the record, we have 10 minutes left in the vote. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 982 to the House without recommendation. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Pallone.
I would just like to remind my Democratic colleagues that the motion is a motion to table, and so I would urge you to vote.
It is to report the resolution without recommendation. It is not a motion to table.
Well, let me inquire, Mr. Chairman, before the vote continues. What is it again? Would you explain what
the
we're
motion
voting
I
on?
placed was is to report the resolution.
Parliamentary inquiry.
No, stop, please. The question now, here's what I said. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 982 to the House without recommendation. That is the vote before us.
You can't interrupt a
So that means that
it's not, this is not, that is, I've restated the resolution that we're voting on. That's what I put forward.
Well,
Clerk will
let me
continue
just
to call
ask,
the roll.
Mr.
You
Chairman.
can't have debate in the middle of a roll
Clerk
call.
will continue to
Well,
call the
because
roll.
I think it's unclear what we're voting on. What happens if this passes?
It will be reported to the House for consideration. Clerk will
All right,
continue
well, then
to
under
call
that
the roll.
circumstances, I will vote yes.
Pallone.
Yes.
Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo passes. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Dingle. Ms. Dingle votes aye. Chairman Walden.
Aye.
Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye.
Are there other members not recorded? And for the record, the clerk will report the tally. The clerk. Yeah.
30. I have 52. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 52 ayes and 0 nays.
52 ayes, 0 nays. The resolution is adopted and forwarded to the House without recommendation. There's 5 minutes left in the vote on the floor. We will return after this to complete our work on the telecommunications bills. The committee stands in recess. I'll call the committee back to order. The chair calls up H.R. 2345, amendment, or Bill number 11 on your list, is forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology on June 13, 2018, and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2345, to require the Federal Communications Commission to study the feasibility of designating a simple, easy-to-remember dialing code to be used for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline system.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? The gentleman from Florida is recognized for what purpose?
Thank you. To offer an amendment.
Clerk will report the Bilirakis amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2345, offered by Mr. Bilirakis.
Objection. Reading of the amendment dispensed with. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take the 5 minutes. I offer this simple amendment to ensure that both the House and the Senate Committees on Veterans Affairs also receive copies of the Commission report. Throughout this Congress, these committees have been at the forefront of reviewing and improving mental health and suicide prevention services for our veterans. This includes House passage of the Veteran Urgent Access to Mental Health Care Act and hearings on assessing PTS treatments at the VA. This amendment will ensure that all relevant committees timely receive the study report on a veteran-specific suicide prevention hotline code. As the Vice Chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, as a co-sponsor of the underlying bill, I stand ready to help, again, to inform the veterans population of this important change if the report yields a positive result and the new dialing code comes to fruition. So I'm happy to yield any time to any other member. Otherwise, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair thanks the gentleman for this very thoughtful amendment for his work to help our nation's veterans. Are there other members seeking recognition? If not, the question arises on a passage of the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, the question now arises on favorably reporting H.R. 2345 as amended to the House. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.R. 3994. That's number 12 on your list. Is forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology on June 13, 2018. Ask clerk to report.
H.R. 3994, to establish the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? For what purpose? The gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the Tonko amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3994, offered by Mr. Tonko.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Chair and Ranking Member for moving this important legislation forward, and I offer special thanks to Representative Lance for partnering with me on this effort. Thanks also to the bipartisan group of members who have co-sponsored our legislation, including 14 members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. that have worked together with a shared belief that this is an issue worth addressing. I know from our conversations and my own experience that we're hearing from constituents across our districts on the need for basic broadband access. We know that advancing critical connectivity expands service, small business resources, opportunities, access, and data based on assessed need and demand. As it happens, that is also the full name of our bill, H.R. 3994, the Access Broadband Act, which would establish a coordinating office for federal broadband resources. It would use existing assets to streamline management of federal broadband resources across multiple agencies and simplify the process for small businesses and local economic developers to leverage them. Broadband internet access can be the difference between success and failure for students doing homework, job seekers training for a new career, doctors reading a medical scan, or entrepreneurs starting a small business. However, to date, the federal government has done a poor job of tracking broadband deployment. Currently, there is no comprehensive system that tracks where federal dollars are going and how the funding is impacting communities. Investments are made with little accountability and oversight on behalf of the taxpayer. Access Broadband would begin to address this issue. Our bill tracks federal broadband dollars, streamlines management of federal broadband resources across multiple agencies, and most notably, it simplifies the process for small businesses and local economic developers to access them. We made two minor changes in this amendment, including more clearly defining broadband support in Section 6 and updating the IMLS programs to better reflect which programs offer broadband support. I thank everyone for their work on Access Broadband, and with that, urge members to support the amendment. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the Tonko amendment? If not, for what purpose, gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized. Speak on the amendment.
Thank you. I thank Congressman Tonko for his leadership on this legislation. The amendments are technical in response to discussions with the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And this underlying bill will ensure that additional federal broadband support is being offered in a technologically neutral manner and that overbuilding of broadband is avoided. I urge adoption of Mr. Tonko's amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Other members seeking recognition on the amendment. Anyone else seeking recognition on the underlying bill? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment's adopted. Any further discussion on the underlying bill as amended? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2345 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The bill is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.R. 4881 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology on June 13, 2018, and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4881, to require the Federal Communications Commission to establish a task force for meeting the connectivity and technology needs of precision agriculture in the United States.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Who's seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latta.
Thank you.
For what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have a bipartisan amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the Latta amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4881, offered by Mr. Latta.
The chair now, without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair now recognizes Mr. Latta for purposes of speaking on his and Mr. Lobosak's amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H.R. 4881, as forwarded by the subcommittee, adds the full definition of broadband internet access service as written in the federal code and allows the definition to evolve based on findings at the Federal Communications Commission. Furthermore, the amendment adds representatives to the task force with expertise in broadband network data collection, geospatial analysis, and coverage mapping. We all know that current broadband maps are not fully reliable or accurate, but a key duty of the task force is to determine whether broadband access is lacking most, Therefore, we believe including experts on the task force that can speak on the mapping data and standards will have a positive effect on achieving the bill's underlying goal of evaluating and expanding broadband to unserved agricultural areas. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from Iowa is recognized. 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
I thank the chair and ranking member for having this markup today and bringing the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act up for consideration. I'm very proud to have worked on this legislation with my good friend, Representative Latta, and I'm hopeful that after committee passage today, we can quickly move to bring this legislation to the House floor and pass this act. I have met with small businesses, farmers, and rural telecommunications companies across Iowa over the past several years and here in D.C., and the importance of expanding high-speed internet access to rural areas is consistently a top priority. That's because internet access is just as critical for economic development, job growth, businesses, farmers, and families in rural America as it is in big cities. And we in rural America often have to continue to remind folks of that. Farming is an integral component, of course, of the rural economy and a source of pride for the rural community. And we need to be doing more to make sure that they have the tools to do their jobs and provide for the rest of us as well. The Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act will establish a task force to examine the broadband needs of farmers and rural communities so they can take advantage of these new technological advances in order to increase crop yields. The amendment Mr. Latta and I are offering today, and again I thank him for working with me on this issue, will ensure that members of the task force have the necessary expertise in data collection, geospatial analysis, and coverage mapping to improve the maps and get broadband to where it is needed most. I like to say garbage in is garbage out. Let's get the right things in before we get the right things out. It's the only way to do it when it comes to information. We must focus on giving family farmers the opportunity to continue the long tradition of family farming, and ensuring they have access to precision agriculture technologies is one of the best ways to support that. With that, I encourage members to support this amendment and the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act and America's farmers, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members? On the full bill? Okay, so we'll get to that. Any other members wanting to speak on the amendment? If not, the question now arises on passing the Latta-Loebsack amendment.
On the bill.
We got to do the amendment first.
Right.
Then you can strike on the bill, right? Am I doing all right here? Let's vote on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment's adopted. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, anchoring the important last seat on the committee. Sort of. Next to last. That's right. We got a new. That's right. You've moved up in seniority recently.
Yes, sir, I have.
I forget that.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Well, I think so. That'd be a good idea. We'll recognize you to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I speak today in support of Chairman Latta's bill, the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act of 2018. This bill is a step forward in modernizing and maximizing the agricultural tools and output that is the livelihood of our country's agricultural communities. In my home state of Georgia, agriculture means one of the top industries with incredible strides made in improving the crops and techniques of our ag industry. Chairman Latta's bill, which requires the FCC to establish a new task force for meeting connectivity and technology needs of precision agriculture, will help to identify shortfalls in rural broadband and how to overcome them. While the number of people who make their living off agriculture has fallen, our yields have increased thanks to technological improvements in the practices of the men and women who grow and produce our food stocks. Our farmers and ranchers face a different situation with overwhelmingly dedication towards what they do day in and day out. Improving the connectivity in these areas, allowing them to use more technology to improve their operations, will help our rural communities and will increase our agricultural returns. I want to thank Chairman Latta for introducing this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of the time. Other members seeking recognition?
Sure.
Seeing none, I'd like to go now to the chairman of the DCCP subcommittee, Mr. Latta, to speak on the bill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, it will be brief, but again, I'd like to thank you for bringing up this bill today before the full committee, and I express my support again for H.R. 4881, the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act. I want to thank my colleague, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Loebsack, for his work on this as we introduce this bill, because we recognize the need for high-speed broadband in rural agricultural land so that farmers can incorporate advanced technologies into their operations. Without broadband, farmers cannot utilize precision agriculture to help maximize resources, to reduce costs, increase crop yields, and promote environmentally sustainable practices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the measure, and I thank you very much for bringing the bill up, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Other members seeking recognition to speak on this bill? Seeing none, the question now arises on favorably reporting H.R. 4881 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall say aye. 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 Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is adopted. Now, for record purposes, it's been brought to my attention I may have cited the wrong bill when we had a roll call vote before and perhaps confused it with 2345. It should have been 3944 as amended. 3944 as amended. So there was no opposition to it. I just read the wrong bill number, I'm told. Grabbed the wrong sheet. So just for the record, I have 3944. Maybe that's...
It's 3994. So we screwed up that.
Oh. Well, that explains a lot. The bill is actually 3994. The talking point says 3944. Yeah. I'm not blaming it on the staff. There clearly was an invasion of the computer system. It was hacked. All right. Moving right along. Next. Just wanted to thank you for bringing that to our attention. We want to be correct here. Chair now calls up H.R. 5709. On your program, that'd be number 14, as forwarded by the Committee on Communications Technology on June 13, 2018, and asks our clerk to report.
H.R. 5709, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide for enhanced penalties for pirate radio and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments? Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York. For what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I have a bipartisan amendment at the desk.
Will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5709, offered by Mr. Collins.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes changes to the underlying bill that will prevent pirates from wreaking havoc on our broadcast system. In terms of enforcement, this amendment requires annual enforcement sweeps with additional monitoring sweeps and gives the FCC the ability to swiftly initiate penalties on illegal operators. Additionally, this amendment requires the FCC to establish a pirate radio broadcasting database. This database will include a list of legally licensed stations and a list of known pirates or entities who have received notices of noncompliance by the FCC. The database will empower local ad purchasers to ensure they are purchasing time from legitimately licensed stations. The goal of this database is to deter local businesses and other ad purchasers from allowing their funds to prop up these bad actors. I thank Representative Lance for his leadership on this legislation. This is an issue that I've been involved in for many years, and I'm proud to be part of a resolution. I want to thank the chairman again for his support, urge adoption of my amendment, and yield the balance of my time to Mr. Lance.
Thank you, Mr. Collins, and I thank Mr. Collins for his amendment, which I support. I also thank Congressman Doyle for his leadership on this issue. Pirate radio is a public safety issue that affects broadcasters and consumers around the country. I'm hopeful that providing the FCC with the additional enforcement tools in this bill will lead to meaningful results in combating pirate radio. I urge the adoption of the Collins amendment, and I also urge adoption of the underlying bill that I am proud to support with Ranking Member Doyle of the subcommittee. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Time is controlled by the gentleman from New York.
I yield to the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be offering this amendment with Mr. Collins and happy that the co-sponsors of this bill, Mr. Lance and Mr. Tonko, as well as the majority, work with us to address some of the concerns with this bill. This amendment will help ensure that the FCC's Enforcement Bureau addresses the threats posed by pirate radio while not unduly taking away time and resources from other critical missions conducted by the Bureau and the Commission's field staff. I'm pleased that we were able to strike this balance and look forward to continuing to work with the majority on this legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge its adoption and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank Representative Lance for all of his hard work on the important legislation. I thank the New York broadcasters for its dedication to this effort. For years now, I, along with many members of the New York and New Jersey delegations, have voiced our concerns on the issue, yet pirate radio operators are as prevalent as ever, and their actions have been met with few consequences. One of the most serious concerns is that pirate radio broadcasters interfere with the Emergency Alert Services, or EAS, signal broadcast, thereby threatening millions of Americans' ability to receive notification in the event of an emergency or national crisis. This represents a growing threat as climate change causes more and more extreme weather events. Pirates also interfere with airport communications. They do not comply with consumer protection laws or any FCC regulations, exposing consumers, especially those living in the most vulnerable communities, and in some cases causing very real hardships. This legislation comes in response to the growing number of pirate radio broadcasters in our nation that are harming consumers and public safety. The FCC has taken some positive steps to remedy this issue, but more needs to be done. The Pirate Act would increase penalties and restrictions on pirate radio, whether a radio frequency is being used by first responders coordinating to save lives or parents who just want to keep obscenity and bigotry away from their children. Our communities are better served when broadcasters respect the rule of law. With that, I urge all members, to support the amendment and the Pirate Act and yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognized himself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment and the underlying bill. I want to commend my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. As many of you know, I was in the radio business for 21 years and played by the rules, and there are a lot of them. And the things that these pirate radio stations do can be pretty vile and vulgar, and also interfere with legitimate and legal communication. And so it is important our committee take these steps. I commend members on both sides for helping move this effort forward, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now arises on the Collins-Doyle amendment, I believe. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment's adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the bill? If not, the question now arises on forwarding H.R. 5709 as amended to the House floor, do pass. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. And H.R. 5709 is, as amended, forwarded to the floor. Without objection, staff's authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation considered by the committee today. So ordered, and without objection.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
If I could, House Rule 11, Clause 2L accords the committee minority 2 additional calendar days to file supplemental and dissenting views on legislation that is reported out and forwarded to the House. Pursuant to that rule and clause, I'm giving notice of our intent to file such views, and I thank you.
And the committee stands adjourned. Thank you, everyone.